It is the mid-18th century, on the shores of West Africa. Here lies the bustling port of Ouidah, on the slave coast. A mosaic of humanity. African traders in bright woven cloth haggle with Europeans over human lives, speaking in a cacophony of languages. Long caravans of captives, chained or yoked together, have arrived from the interior after weeks of marching. At the beach, European ships bob at anchor, their holds being filled with these enslaved Africans, destined for the New World. A dynamic, tragic, and complex scene, repeated at dozens of African ports for nearly 4 centuries. It is a scene that challenges the simplistic narrative that it was only the Europeans that orchestrated the slave trade, when in reality, the transatlantic slave trade was fueled by intricate African markets and networks, with African intermediaries and leaders playing pivotal roles, selling their own people. And so today, we travel to the slave markets of Africa that fueled the transatlantic slave trade. This exploration spans from the 15th century through to the 19th century and across the breadth of the African continent. Our focus today will be on the African side of this global enterprise, the local economies, political structures, and the people that supply the enslaved men, women, and children to the New World. We're going to talk about how African kingdoms and merchants were deeply entangled in the trade, sometimes as eager profiteers, sometimes as conflicted participants, and occasionally as resistors. Along the way, we're going to correct some of those common misconceptions, such as the notion that the Europeans greedily swept ashore and simply captured Africans at will. Instead, we'll see a more complicated reality emerge. Local African rulers negotiating with European buyers, local wars feeding the coastal slave markets, and a tragic cycle in which Africans both facilitated and suffered from the trade. We'll also see key regions and ports, from Senegambia and Elmina on the Gold Coast to Ouidah in West Africa and Luanda in Central Africa. And we'll talk about how African leaders and communities navigated the pressures and opportunities of the trade. And there'll be plenty of anecdotes from historical witnesses, drawing only on primary sources for these to bring this distant world to life. Certainly, by the end, you'll come out with a more nuanced understanding of how the transatlantic slave trade was not a one-sided European operation, but a system of exchange with deep African roots. All right, hello everyone. Introductions all out of the way. Allow me to welcome you to the channel. Perhaps it's your first time here, you've not clicked that subscribe button yet. Well, if you haven't, I invite you to do so. It's right next to the like button, conveniently, and you're welcome to leave your thoughts in the comments. This video is enjoyable completely ad-free on YouTube because of the generous contributions of those on Patreon and the YouTube memberships. Thank you also for checking out the merch store. Now, with introductions all out of the way, let's begin. The transatlantic slave trade. It had its beginnings in the mid-15th century, when European ships first reached coastal West Africa. At the time, African societies were already very familiar with slavery and slave trading, but on a much smaller scale. For instance, through trans-Saharan caravans that sent captives north, or through local wars where captives became slaves. But the arrival of the Portuguese in the 1440s introduced a new and voracious overseas demand. The Portuguese initially tried slave raiding, notably a 1444 expedition in Senegambia, but these forays were met with fierce resistance and ultimately proved to be less effective than trade. Coastal African rulers were soon willing to exchange captives, usually people from rival ethnic groups or war captives, for iron, textiles, firearms, any other goods that the Europeans brought. Indeed, it's been said that during the earliest years of the slave trade, the Portuguese generally preferred purchased Africans who had been enslaved during tribal wars, rather than taking the trouble of capturing them outright. And so, by the late 1400s, a steady trade was established. Enslaved Africans were being transported to work on sugar plantations in the Atlantic islands like Madeira, Sao Tome, and the Cape Verde Islands. Soon after 1500, with the European conquest of the Americas, the demand for labor was seeing a new boom. The Spanish began shipping enslaved Africans to the Caribbean as early as 1502. The Portuguese, operating from bases like Elmina on the Gold Coast, and later Sao Tome and Luanda in Angola, dominated the trade through the 16th century. During this period, African coastal kingdoms cooperated to supply slaves in exchange for valuable imports. For example, the Wolof Empire in Senegambia became a major supplier of slaves in the 1500s. It is estimated that as much as 1/3 of all enslaved Africans exported before 1600 came from the Senegambia region under Wolof influence. The Kingdom of Benin, that is, present-day Nigeria, also traded slaves with the Portuguese in the early 1500s, though notably Benin's obas, that is, kings, soon restricted slave exports, preferring to trade other goods like ivory and pepper. This is once they saw the destabilizing effects of the slave trade on their society. One illustrative early case is the Kingdom of Kongo in Central Africa. Kongo initially welcomed Portuguese contact in the late 15th century. Its king, Nzinga Nkuwu, converted to Christianity, and his son, Afonso, maintained close relations with Portugal. However, the Congolese soon grew alarmed at how the trade in captives was undermining their kingdom. In 1526, King Afonso I of Congo wrote a famous letter to the King of Portugal, pleading for an end to the uncontrolled slave trading. He lamented that Portuguese merchants were giving African traders so many enticing goods that the sons of this country are enslaved and kidnapped, even noblemen and the sons of noblemen, leading to the depopulation of his realm. Afonso complained that his authority was being undermined as unscrupulous people within Congo abducted others to sell to the Europeans for merchandise. He wrote, "So great, sir, is the corruption, that our country is being completely depopulated." Now this account shows that from early on, African leaders understood the disruptive impact of the slave trade. Despite Afonso's pleas and his attempt to ban the export of slaves from the Congo, the trade continued under less centralized conditions, often by rogue merchants and local chiefs beyond the king's control. Thus, by the end of the 16th century, the pattern was set. European buyers, anchored at coastal forts or on ships, relied on African suppliers to bring them captives from the interior. In these early centuries, the volume was still relatively small compared to what it would become, but the foundations of African involvement were laid. African elites had begun to see the trade as a source of wealth and European goods, while others already saw it as dangerous. This tension between the lure of profit and the peril to society would play out across Africa in the coming centuries as the transatlantic trade grew in scale. As the transatlantic slave trade entered its peak centuries, the 17th and 18th, its operations on African soil became more systematized. To understand the African slave markets, we must look at how captives were acquired, and how the markets were organized, and ultimately what was exchanged. The process typically began with a capture in the interior. Most enslaved Africans were seized in the context of local conflicts, wars between kingdoms, raids on neighboring villages, or punitive expeditions. African rulers and warlords recognized that prisoners of war could be sold for a decent profit. Some states even went to war primarily to secure captives for sale. For instance, the Kingdom of Dahomey in the 18th century notoriously conducted annual raids on its neighbors to capture men, women, and children who could be sold to the Europeans. Others, like the Asante Empire on the Gold Coast, fought wars of expansion that yielded prisoners who became a form of tribute or trade currency. In parts of equatorial Africa, bands of professional raiders, such as the Imbangala in Angola, roamed the countryside, kidnapping people and funneling them to coastal markets. After the capture, the captives were often marched in caravans toward the coast. Well, this could be a brutal journey, hundreds of miles. Many did not survive the trek due to hunger, disease, or abuse. On the way, captives might pass through inland slave markets or fairs, trading hubs where local dealers bought and sold humans. For example, in the Bight of Biafra hinterland, today's southeastern Nigeria and Cameroon, there were well-known slave fairs at places like Arochukwu and Uburu. The Aro merchants, an Igbo trading network, had established a quasi-monopoly over the interior trade. They operated under the aegis of a famous oracle, the shrine at Chukwu at Arochukwu, using religion to sanction the enslavement of those accused of crimes or witchcraft. Through this system, the Aro Confederacy funneled tens of thousands of Igbo and other nations from the interior to the coast. In his memoir, Oluwadu Equiano, an Igbo child who was kidnapped around 1753, described being seized by African kidnappers while his parents were away in the fields, and then being sold from one African owner to another over months until finally he reached the coast. His account shows that from the point of capture to the point of sale, to Europeans that is, an enslaved African might change hands multiple times within Africa. Once the caravans reached the coast, they entered the coastal slave markets. These markets took different forms depending on the region. In some places, they were fortified trading posts, often called slave castles, operated by Europeans in partnership with local authorities. For instance, the Elmina castle on the Gold Coast, or the Gorée Island in Senegambia. At such forts, European factors, or agents, would inspect and purchase captives delivered by African brokers. In other regions, there were open beach markets or trading towns, where European ships anchored offshore and African traders came out to meet them. The Bight of Biafra coast worked in this manner. Europeans didn't build any forts, but they anchored their ships in places like Old Calabar or Bonny, and negotiated with local merchant princes. We have a vivid description of an African slave market that comes from Willem Bosman, a Dutch trader on the Guinea coast. Around 1700, Bosman wrote that Ouidah or Ouidah markets are of men here kept in the same manner as those of beasts are with us, meaning that enslaved people were openly bartered and examined like cattle in the marketplace. This blunt observation, from a participant's perspective, highlights the commodification of humans in these transactions. The actual exchange was driven by economic incentive on both sides. Europeans offered guns, gunpowder, textiles, metal bars, alcohol, and other trades goods as currency. In return, Africans sold Africans. Prices fluctuated with supply and demand. There was also a system of credit and trust in operation. European captains, anxious to fill their ships quickly, would often advance goods to the African suppliers, essentially giving goods on credit, with the promise that the local trader would deliver a certain number of slaves in the coming weeks or months. But this was risky, so to secure the deal, Africans and Europeans developed a practice called pawnship. One side would hand over a pawn, a person, as collateral, sometimes a relative of the African trader, or in other cases, a European crewman left in the African trader's custody, to guarantee the debt, either slaves or goods owed, would be repaid. Duke, an Efik merchant of old Calabar, noted in his diary in the 1780s how such pawning was used to enforce honest dealing on both sides. Another important aspect was the African control of commercial protocol. Coastal African leaders often imposed customs duties and regulations on Europeans. In the kingdom of Dahomey, for instance, the king claimed a royal monopoly on slave trading. All sales in Ouidah had to go through the king's agents, through private merchants still operated under his system. In old Calabar, the local chiefs, like Duke's family, charged European slave ships a trading fee called komi before any business could take place. They demanded that visiting captains pay proper gifts and obey local rules. If a European captain tried to bypass these rules or cheat the Africans, trade could be cut off. Indeed, offending captains were sometimes forced to depart empty-handed. Thus, far from Europeans simply dictating terms, the African side had set up its own structure to govern the trade. At the coast, captives were typically held in barracoons or compounds while awaiting shipment. In European forts like Elmina or Cape Coast Castle, dungeon-like holding cells warehoused hundreds of captives at a time. At ports controlled by African authorities, the captives might be kept in stockades or the houses of traders until the moment of embarkation. When a slave ship was ready to load, final negotiations took place, often involving inspection of the captives by the European buyers. The enslaved, tragically, were treated like merchandise, examined for health and strength, sometimes branded with hot irons to mark a buyer's ownership. Once a private price was settled and the payment in goods complete, the captives were conveyed in small boats or canoes out to the waiting ship. Many African observers watched those ships depart over the horizon, knowing they carried sons, daughters, or former neighbors, and understanding that those people would likely never return. So, the mechanics of the slave trade, to sum it up, on the African side involved a chain of African participants, raiders or soldiers who captured people, middlemen who transported and sold them, and local merchants and chiefs who negotiated with the European ship captains. European traders usually remained at the periphery, on board ships or inside coastal forts, while African networks brought the human cargo to them. African political and economic systems thus shaped the trade at every turn. With this general framework in mind, let's use it to examine several major African regions and ports in a little bit more detail. And we'll see how these dynamics played out differently across different parts of the continent. So let's start with the Senegambia region. It was the first among those areas linked with the transatlantic slave trade. So we're talking around the Senegal and Gambia rivers. That's where they get the name from. Quite clever. Portuguese ships reached this coast in the mid-15th century, and by the 1500s, the trade was well established. Coastal kingdoms such as Wolof and Kayor and others engaged in commerce with the Europeans. In the 16th century, Wolof was a powerful empire. It became a major supplier of enslaved people, especially after the collapse of older Mali Empire's influence in the region. African merchants and rulers in Senegambia traded slaves for horses, highly valued in that area, cloth too, and other goods. Some captives were people who had been slaves within Africa, for example, pawns or those sold for debt, while others were war captives from conflicts between local states. But significantly, not all in Senegambia acquiesced to the trade. There are accounts of local resistance. For instance, the Jola people of Casamance and certain other communities largely refused to participate, sometimes moving their villagers to more defensible locations to avoid slave raids. In the late 18th century, an important anti-slave trader stance emerged in Senegambia under a Muslim leader named Abdul Kader Ghane, the Almami of Futa Toro, a theocratic Fulani state along the middle Senegal River. In 1787, the Almami Abdul Kader forbade the passage of any slaves through Futa Toro for sale to Europeans. At the time, several French slaving ships were waiting at the mouth of the Senegal River, only to find that the caravans of captives were no longer coming. Ghane declared that no one in his realm, no Muslim, could be sold into slavery, effectively cutting off a major supply route. The French, frustrated in their business, even sent gifts to persuade him to relent, but he held firm. This early abolitionist measure is a striking example of an African leader taking a moral and political stand against the slave trade, even as neighboring rulers continued to sell captives. Meanwhile, European presence in Senegambia remained limited to coastal enclaves. In the island of Gorée, just off Dakar, and St. Louis at the mouth of the Senegal were key slaving trade ports, changing hands between the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and English over time. Through such African-European partnership, the trade in the Senegambia persisted into the 18th century. By the 19th century, however, it declined as France began to shift the region's economy toward legitimate commerce, that is, peanuts, gum arabic, as European anti-slave trade patrols increased. Senegambia's experience highlights that at the very gateway of Atlantic Africa, the slave trade was both enabled by African polities and, in pockets, actively resisted by them. Moving eastward along the Guinea coast, the region known as the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, had a long history of contact with Europeans, initially focused on gold, hence the name, but later increasingly on slaves. The Portuguese built Elmina castle there in 1482, originally to secure access to gold fields. For over a century, gold was the primary export. By the 17th century, however, the dynamic had shifted. The Dutch seized Elmina in 1637 and expanded the castle's dungeons to hold slaves as the transatlantic demand grew. Numerous other European forts and trading lodges soon dotted the coastline. Cape Coast Castle, British, Fort Amsterdam, Anamabu, and more, creating a highly competitive environment under the watchful eyes of African authorities inland. On the African side, the Akan peoples dominated commerce in the Gold Coast. In the interior, the Asante Empire rose to prominence in the late 17th century, conquering neighboring Akan states and gaining control over lucrative gold-producing areas. The Ashanti Empire's economy was not singularly dependent on slave exports. It was also built on gold and the kola nut trade. But warfare was integral to their expansion, and war captives were frequently sold to the coast. One British visitor to Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, in the early 19th century, recorded the Ashanti king Ose Bonsu's candid rationale for trading slaves. The king reportedly explained that if he did not sell his war captives to the Europeans, he would have to kill them, as retaining large numbers of enemy prisoners could destabilize the kingdom. Well, an anecdote like that shows how African leaders rationalize their participation. Far better to sell them off than to send them off to the next world. Now, on the coast itself, African merchant brokers played their own role. The Fante people, who lived in the coastal littoral below Ashanti, often acted as intermediaries. They formed a network of brokers, sometimes called kabukiers, who bought slaves and other goods from the interior to the European forts. Fante coastal towns such as Anamabu and Cape Coast thus became thriving commercial centers. Europeans could not simply march inland to Ashanti. They relied on African allies and trading partners to maintain the flow of goods and people. The relationship between the Fante and Ashanti was complex. They were trading partners, but also rivals, and they fought wars in the 18th century, in part over control of these trade routes. Elmina and other forts functioned as the terminus of these supply lines. By the 18th century, Elmina Castle was dispatching immense numbers of captives annually. One estimate holds that by that time, about 30,000 enslaved people per year passed through Elmina's dungeons on their way to the Americas. Most of these individuals had been collected from a wide hinterland extending north and west. European records from these forts speak of slave caravans arriving, sometimes hundreds at once, often in miserable condition after long treks. They also described haggling with local brokers, payment of customs to local chiefs, and occasional breakdowns in trade due to African political changes. For example, if a local king died or if a war cut off a supply route, European forts might sit idle for months. And of course, time is money. Now, it is worth noting that the Gold Coast had a highly regulated trade environment. The presence of multiple European forts meant African sellers could in some sense shop around for the best deals, playing one European nation off against another. Conversely, Europeans sometimes coordinated to try to stabilize prices. But ultimately, African suppliers had the upper hand in dictating when and how the trade would occur. If there was a shortage of captives, say during a lull in local wars, European buyers simply had to wait or sail elsewhere. The power of the Asante was formidable. In 1824, an Ashanti army even descended to the coast and defeated a British force near Cape Coast in a dispute over trade, demonstrating that African states could indeed challenge the Europeans militarily if they were provoked. The story of the Gold Coast, therefore, is one of a prosperous African region whose leaders, especially in the Asante kings, integrated the African slave trade into their political economy, but always on the terms shaped by African politics. In fact, even today, Elmina Castle is still there, a stark monument to this human commerce. Continuing along West Africa, we come to the Bight of Benin, known to the European merchants of the 18th century as the Slave Coast, due to the vast numbers of captives shipped from its harbors. Not the best name, I suppose, but certainly shows the situation. It was here that a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states vied for control of the trade. In the 17th century, the coastal kingdom of Alada and the port of Ouidah were prominent suppliers. However, there was a dramatic power shift that occurred in the early 18th century, when the inland kingdom of Dahomey rose to dominance under King Agaja. In 1727, Dahomey's armies conquered Ouidah, taking its thriving slave ports. Thereafter, Dahomey became one of the most notorious slave-trading states in Africa. At its height, Dahomey had a highly militarized society geared towards slave raiding and trading. The Dahomeyan kings built a standing army, which included the famous female warriors often called the Dahomey Amazons, that conducted frequent raids on neighboring peoples. Captives from these campaigns were marched to the Dahomey capital of Abomey, or directly to Ouidah on the coast. Some captives were kept for local use. Dahomey maintained a large population of domestic slaves and also practiced human sacrifice of war prisoners during the kingdom's annual customs ritual. But the majority were still sold to the Europeans at the coast. The monarchy established a royal monopoly. European traders could only buy slaves through the king's appointed agents, and they paid customs duties and offered tribute to the king for the privilege. In Ouidah, multiple European nations maintained trading lodges or small forts. The French, English, Portuguese, Brazilians, they all had a presence, but they operated at Dahomey's sufferance. One European visitor in the 1770s noted that the king of Dahomey set the terms and could halt a trade on a whim. In effect, European factors had to negotiate with powerful African officials, always on the king's terms. Ouidah itself was one of the busiest slave ports in the world during the 18th century. Historians estimate that over the slave trade era, more than 1 million Africans were sent from Ouidah across the Atlantic, second only to Luanda, Angola, in volume. Most went to Brazil and the Caribbean. The city was cosmopolitan in its own way, a mix of local Dahomeyan people and other Africans from the interior, along with European traders, Afro-Brazilian returnees who served as middlemen. Yet Europeans in Ouidah never numbered more than a few hundred at a time. The bulk of commerce was conducted by African merchants under Dahomey's authority. A notable figure was Francisco Felix de Souza, a Brazilian-born trader who became the Dahomey king's chief commercial agent in Ouidah in the early 19th century, illustrating how even foreign traders had to be sanctioned and integrated into the Dahomeyan system. But the kings of Dahomey they grew wealthy and formidable through the sale of human beings. King Gezo, who ruled from 1818 to 1858, famously resisted British pressures to abolish the trade. He is quoted as saying in the 1840s, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." Well, that's a hell of a declaration, isn't it? But it lays bare how deeply the slave trade had become embedded in their economy and ideology. It was the kingdom's lifeblood. Even when Britain and France began suppressing the Atlantic slave trade in the early and mid-19th century, Dahomey continued it for years. Only in the 1850s, after the British naval blockades and growth of alternative exports like palm oil, did Dahomey finally begin to redirect its economy. East of Dahomey, the Yoruba Empire of Oyo likewise supplies slaves from its wars until it collapsed in the early 19th century. Thereafter, chaotic conflicts in Yoruba land fed the trade through ports like Lagos, until the British annexed Lagos in 1851 to suppress it. So in summary, the Slave Coast exemplified a region where African state power was heavily leveraged to maximize the slave trade. From the kings of Dahomey, who orchestrated raids and dictated terms to European buyers, to the shifting fortunes of Yoruba realms further east, the Bight of Benin's slave markets were fundamentally shaped by African political ambition and rivalry. The grim calculus of exchanging guns for slaves played out here in especially stark terms. Dahomey and its peers imported large quantities of firearms and gunpowder, and they used that to capture even more slaves, and they used the slaves to purchase even more firearms and gunpowder, and they used that to, well, I don't have to go on, but it's a destructive feedback loop. Violence and commerce, devastating countless communities, and destroying innumerable families. Further east, on the Atlantic coast, lies the Bight of Biafra, encompassing parts of modern Nigeria, like the Niger Delta and the Cross River region, and western Cameroon. Unlike the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast, this area didn't have a large central kingdom dominating the trade. You see, it was characterized by powerful merchant networks and small coastal states. As I've mentioned, the interior supply was largely controlled by the Aro Confederacy, an alliance of Igbo traders and priests centered on Arochukwu. The Aro network fed captives from a wide hinterland into the Delta ports. They used the authority of their oracle to justify enslaving people. For example, individuals condemned by the shrine for alleged crimes of witchcraft might be sold off as slaves, ostensibly as a form of divine judgment or divine sanction. Through such means, the Aro amassed enormous influence over the slave trade in this region. On the coast, the key outlets were the Delta city-states of Bonny, Old Calabar, Brass, and New Calabar. These were not empires, but each was ruled by its own king or council of chiefs, often themselves wealthy slave traders. They became extremely active middlemen between the Aro interior networks and the European ships. For instance, at Old Calabar, also called Duketown, a handful of Efik aristocratic families, with surnames like Duke, Eyamba, and Henshaw, dominated the trade. Antera Duke, whose diary provides a rare African perspective on the trade, was one such merchant prince. He and his peers ran what amounted to a slave-dealing houses in Calabar, complete with agents upriver, and established partnerships with British captains. When English slave ships arrived at the Cross River estuary, the Calabar chiefs would negotiate the price, enforce the collection of debts or the payment of gomé, and even hold British crew members hostage as pawns if trust broke down. A striking aspect of the Bight of Biafra trade is that Europeans did not establish permanent forts or colonies in this stretch of coast. They didn't need to. The African trading communities were well organized, and they provided every service, including marshalling slaves and provisioning the ships. European captives anchored offshore, and African brokers came out to meet them in large canoes, bringing samples of trade goods and bargaining over prices. The volume of exports from this region was enormous. The Bight of Biafra became the third largest source of African slaves of the Americas, after West Central Africa and the Bight of Benin during the 18th century. Many of these captives were Igbo or Ibibio from the hinterland. They were dispersed mainly to British Caribbean or North America, which is one reason why that even today a significant portion of African Americans have genetic heritage traced to this region. The dynamics here were marked by decentralized violence. The absence of a unifying empire meant that a myriad of micro-level conflicts and kidnappings fed the trade. Oral histories in Igbo communities still recount how people feared the threat of kidnappers or the manipulations of Aro agents. It is said that some villagers planted spiked barriers or moved their markets to thwart slave raiders. The social fabric was severely strained by these disruptions. Still, a few African communities in the region found ways to protect themselves. The inland town, for example, of Abeokuta, in today's Ogun State, Nigeria, was founded in the 1820s by refugees from various Yoruba and other communities fleeing the slave raids, and that includes some repatriated slaves returning from Sierra Leone. Abeokuta grew into a formidable fortified city, and notably defeated Dahomey's invading army in 1851, becoming a kind of safe haven, a promised land, away from the coastal slave trade. The Bight of Biafra's slave trade functioned through African merchant entrepreneurship, rather than a large state apparatus, which is what made it different. African agents here were consummate traders. The Aro chieftains and the Delta kings alike profited by orchestrating the capture, transport, and sale of human beings, all while negotiating shrewdly with European buyers. Activities like this highlight yet another facet of African involvement. Not empire builders like Dahomey, but networks of merchants who turned the misery of others into wealth, operating a devastating commerce that preyed on the fragmentation of their region. But of course, no account of the African side of the slave trade would be complete without West Central Africa, the single largest source of captives sent across the Atlantic. This broad region, covering today's Angola, Republic of the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and surrounding areas, supplied nearly half of all enslaved Africans transported to the Americas. The trade here began early and lasted the longest. The Portuguese established a permanent foothold in the kingdom of Ndongo, present-day Angola, in the late 1500s, founding the port city of Luanda in 1575. By the 17th century, Luanda had grown into the busiest slave port in Africa. sending tens of thousands of people each year to Portuguese colonies, especially Brazil. Along with Luanda, the port of Benguela, further south on the Angolan coast, founded in 1617, became another major slaving outlet. African political organization in this region was complex and in flux. The Kingdom of Kongo to the north had been a centralized state since the 1400s and initially engaged with the Portuguese on relatively equal terms. But as the slave trade grew, Kongo was destabilized. After King Afonso's attempts to control the trade in the 1520s, as we discussed earlier, failed, Kongo gradually fell into civil wars. Many of these conflicts were stoked by competing factions trying to capture and sell slaves to the Portuguese. In 1665, the Congolese king was even killed in a battle against the Portuguese, and the once mighty kingdom fragmented into smaller realms. But of course, the slave business had to continue. Further south, the Portuguese fought lengthy wars with the kingdom of Ndongo and its allies. A legendary figure, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and later Matamba, led a determined resistance against the Portuguese in the 1620s to 50s, at times even allying with the Dutch to counter the Portuguese power. Nzinga turned her inland territory into a refuge for those fleeing the Portuguese and Imbangala raids. Yet after her death, Portuguese expansion resumed. The Portuguese often allied with brutal bands of mercenaries known as the Imbangala, whose way of life was raiding and warfare. The Imbangala in the 1600s became the main suppliers of slaves to the Portuguese in Angola. Armed with European guns and driven by a violent warrior culture, they wreaked havoc, capturing huge numbers of people. The phrase itself, Imbangala, became synonymous with terror in the region. By the 18th century, the slave system in West Central Africa was highly organized and deeply entrenched. The Portuguese authorities in Luanda and Benguela worked with mixed-race Afro-Portuguese traders and certain African chiefs to funnel slaves out from the interior. There were established routes and markets in the interior, sometimes called slave fairs, at places like Kasanje on the upper Kwanza River, where African brokers exchanged captives for Portuguese goods under agreed rules. The Portuguese government even set up a trading board, junta, in Luanda to oversee the trade and regulate prices at these markets. Nevertheless, chaos and violence remained endemic. Entire districts in the interior were depopulated by constant raiding, with ruined villages and abandoned fields left as grim evidence. Luanda maintained its position as arguably the largest slave-exporting port in Africa. In the 18th century, it was often called the emporium of the slave trade. In one period, 1700 to 1850, nearly 1.5 million people were embarked on slave ships from Luanda and Benguela alone. The vast majority were sent to the Portuguese colony of Brazil, with which Angola had special trading relationships. Indeed, Angolan and Brazilian ports were so connected that some historians speak of a South Atlantic system, centered mainly around the Portuguese colonies. Enslaved Africans from this region were predominantly from groups such as the Mbundu, the Bakongo, of Mbundu, and others drawn from the deep interior by the 19th century. Many ended up on Brazilian sugar and coffee plantations. Some were also taken to the Caribbean, and North America via Spanish and French traders. Even as this mass export continued, African societies in West Central Africa adapted and resisted in various ways. Some inland polities, like the Luanda Empire in the southeast, or the Chokwe or Ovimbundu kingdoms, rose to prominence by controlling trade routes, or offering some refuge from slavers, while also inevitably becoming involved in the commerce themselves. Chiefs in the interior negotiated terms with Portuguese traders, sometimes demanding high prices, or European titles and favors in exchange for cooperation. But overall, the balance of power in this region, unlike in parts of West Africa, increasingly tilted toward the European side by the 19th century. Portugal had established Angola as a colony, and didn't hesitate to use military force against African rulers who impeded the trade. West Central Africa thus presents a picture where the African agency was present, but under extreme duress from direct colonial intrusion. The Portuguese and their allies deliberately fomented conflict to produce captives, and local opportunists took advantage of the lucrative market. Still, without the cooperation of African middlemen, the chiefs who struck deals, the Imbangala who captured slaves, the Afro-Portuguese who could traverse the interior, even the Portuguese could not have sustained the trade at such a volume. A grim partnership of convenience, one that wrecked the demographics and stability of the region for generations. And so, the story of Africa's slave markets during the transatlantic slave trade is a sobering lesson in historical complexity. It demonstrates that the tragedy of the Atlantic slave trade was not the work of one continent alone, but a collaboration that spanned cultures. European slave traders provided the ships, the demand for plantation labor, and the capital. African kings, merchants, and warlords provided the supply of human beings, exploiting internal conflicts and social systems for gain. Without African participation, the slave trade couldn't have grown so immense, and without European and American demand, it would not have arisen as much as it did. By examining the slave markets from Senegambia to Angola, we see agency and decision-making on the African side. Some leaders profited, expanded their realms, while others resisted or fell victim to the trade's disruptions. And we also correct, and very much so, that very simplistic misconception that Europeans alone were responsible for capturing Africans. In reality, the Middle Passage was just the final step of a long journey that often began with an African raid or judicial enslavement. We have to recognize that this nuance does not excuse any of the horrors of the trade, but it rather makes the tragedy more poignant by showing how both Africans were victims and participants. The slave trade was sustained by greed and violence in multiple societies, and its legacy is devastating. Entire regions depopulated or destabilized by the export of millions of people. And so we're left to wonder how African history might have unfolded has these human energies not been siphoned away. And that's a haunting question. Ultimately, the story that we've told today is not the story of one culture or one race oppressing another. It's the tale as old as time, the powerful taking the powerless and exploiting them. It's not that complicated. And, well, unfortunately, that's perhaps a trend that will continue. By the time we realize it, It usually looks a lot worse in hindsight. Now, thank you for joining me. I hope you've learned something. I'm sure you have, unless you're asleep by now. Perhaps you'll go to sleep now, perhaps you'll watch another video. I don't know what you'll do. Feel free to watch another video, though. It's your choice. Let me thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas Ulfadnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Goo Goo Boo Barnick. Okay, that's it from me. A slave ship. One eyewitness to the trade described the ship's deck so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. Such ghastly scenes were common on the transatlantic ships during the height of the slave trade. From the 17th through the early 19th centuries, European and American vessels crisscrossed the Atlantic with human cargo, forging the brutal Middle Passage that carried Africans into the New World. Today, we're going to take a look at the experience of what the enslaved people went through aboard these ships, and we're going to do it in unflinching detail. Where do we get our information? First-hand narratives, ship logs, primary sources. You'll hear it from the people themselves. Our scope is broad and global. The captives came from many regions of Africa, destined to plantations on Brazil, the Caribbean, North America, and beyond. But the one thing they have in common was that the conditions they endured on the voyage were universally horrific. And so, by grounding today's account in the primary sources and eyewitness testimony, we're going to reconstruct how horrifying this journey was. One of unimaginable suffering, and if you were lucky, survival. Let me welcome you to the channel. If you're a newcomer, it's good to meet you. And those who have not yet done so, I invite you to click the subscribe button, which is conveniently right next to the like button. And thank you for those supporting on the Patreon and the merch store. Now, with all that out the way, let's get nice and relaxed, and we may begin. It's going to be a bit of a uncomfortable video, so you may as well relax now. During the height of the transatlantic slave trade, roughly the 1700s, slave ships became a conveyor between continents. Over 12 million Africans were forced onto about 35,000 slave voyages across the Atlantic. By the 1780s, the peak of this traffic, tens of thousands of Africans were sent across the ocean every year to meet the insatiable demand for enslaved labor in the New World. These voyages were all part of a profitable triangular network linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Multiple European colonial powers were involved, including the Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, and Dutch, and each dispatched ships to West and Central Africa to purchase slaves. Enslaved Africans from diverse regions such as Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa all found themselves chained up, first in the markets, then in the holds of the ships. Most would be taken to labor on sugar, coffee, and cotton plantations in the Americas. The largest share were delivered to Portuguese Brazil, millions more to British and French colonies in the Caribbean, and a smaller number to North America. For the captives, The Middle Passage was but one stage of a much longer ordeal. Many had already survived violent capture, coffles marching them to the coast, and imprisonment in slave pens or forts, before they even saw any white man from overseas or any ship come to purchase them. Historians estimate that out of every 100 people seized in Africa, only about 57 of them made it onto a slave ship, and merely 48 survived to be sold in the Americas. Now this means that over half of those captured perished from the point of capture through to the Transatlantic crossing. Most of them didn't even get out of Africa. The Middle Passage itself accounted for 1 million or more deaths. Yet those who did survive the voyage, that didn't mean the suffering was over. Far from it. It was time to get to work. Primary accounts by formerly enslaved Africans offer a rare insight into the moment they were forced aboard a slave ship. One such account comes from Oluwada Equiano, who was about 11 years old when he was kidnapped from his Igbo community in today's Nigeria and sold to European slavers around 1756. Equiano describes his first sight of the Atlantic Ocean and the slave ship waiting for him at anchor, filling him with terror. When he was brought on deck, the crew immediately handled and tossed him to inspect his fitness, much as one would examine livestock. He recalls that the white man's complexions, hair, and language were utterly alien to him, and he feared he encountered a world of bad spirits who intended to kill and eat him. This fear was not uncommon. Many African captives, having never seen Europeans before, believed the slavers to be cannibals. Equiano notes that when he saw a large cooking furnace on deck and the chained Africans around him in despair, that he no longer doubted his fate and fainted from horror. Upon arrival, Equiano was so overwhelmed that he wished for death rather than to know the terrors ahead. He was soon forced down into the ship's hold, where a horrifying new assault on his senses began. He writes, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such salutation in my nostrils as I have never experienced in my life. The stench below deck was overpowering, a foul mix of sweat, vomit, urine, and feces that nearly suffocated him. Equiano became seasick. He refused to eat until the crew members intervened. He describes how when he initially refused food, one man grabbed his hands while another tried to force feed him, an ordeal that threw him into consternation." This foreshadows a common experience. Enslaved people who lost the will to eat were often forcibly fed by the crew, sometimes using a device called the speculum oris to pry their mouths open. Such was the captive's introduction to life aboard the slave ship, one of fear, sensory torment, and immediate violence to enforce compliance. Once the ship was set sail with its cargo, those in the hold faced an environment designed for profit, not for comfort. Slave ships were typically overcrowded to a nightmarish extreme. Men were chained together in pairs and packed spoon-fashioned in rows beneath the decks, with scarcely room to turn themselves. Women and children, though sometimes given slightly more space than allowed on deck, were also crowded into tight quarters. A schematic of the British slave ship Brooks 1788 famously showed over 480 people arranged in a hold, only about 5 feet high, illustrating the practice of tight packing. Traders calculated that packing more people could offset the high mortality rates. Others argued for looser packing, in hopes that more captives would survive to sail. Either way, conditions were unbearable. One ship surgeon, Alexander Falconbridge, observed that enslaved people were often packed so close that it was impossible to sit or stand upright, and that they lay in a tangled mess of bodies and filth. The air quality below deck rapidly became pestilential once the ship was fully loaded. Equiano noted that when all the captives were confined together, the combined heat of the climate and the crowded humanity almost suffocated them. With inadequate ventilation, the atmosphere turned foul and poor of oxygen. The hold reeked of human waste and decay. Equiano accounts that the loathsome smells made the air unfit to breathe and caused widespread sickness among the slaves. The closeness and filth were aggravated by the galling of chains and the captives' limbs, the overflowing of toilet buckets. Children sometimes fell into these little buckets and nearly suffocated in excrement. The combination of heat, lack of sanitation, and stress created a breeding ground for disease. Deadly epidemics of dysentery, smallpox, measles, and fevers swept through the packed ranks. Captains like Thomas Phillips of the Hannibal tried to curb dysentery by feeding captives fiber-rich food, cornmeal, palm oil, pepper, and beans, and providing them citrus fruit, but such measures were meager against rampant illness. On the 1693 voyage of Phillips, 47% of the 700 enslaved Africans died, despite all his efforts. The living lay chained amidst the dying and dead. Equiano described how the shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying filled the gloom, creating a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Disease and despair claimed victims daily. Those who expired from sickness or injuries were unshackled and dumped overboard without ceremony. Sharks often trailed behind slave ships, well accustomed to feeding on the corpses jettisoned at sea. Such macabre details were noted by many observers. The odor of a slave ship was said to carry for miles on the wind, sometimes alerting other vessels, not by sight but by smell. For week after miserable week, the captives were effectively lost at sea, stranded in horrific conditions, not knowing where they were, subject to a regime meant only to keep them alive and subdued until landfall. A stew of human misery and terror. Life aboard a slave ship followed a strict and brutal regimen intended for maximum control over the captives, and to keep them alive, just enough to sell at the journey's end. Each day typically began with the crew doling out meager rations of food and water. Enslaved Africans were usually fed twice a day, often some sort of boiled beans or cornmeal, sometimes supplemented with rice, yams, or a bit of dried meat. This was typically cooked in a large copper pot on deck. Water was severely rationed. An enslaved person might receive about 1 liter of water a day. As Captain Phillips recorded, even these sparse meals could be life-saving. Slavers knew that starved captives would fetch low prices or just not survive at all. However, many captives were too sick or heart-sick to eat anyway. Refusal to eat was common, whether out of protest or extreme despair. A term for it was fixed melancholy. The crew responded by whipping those who would not eat, or using instruments previously described to force-feed them. One slave ship captain admitted to using the speculum oris to pry open the jaws of captives who tried to starve themselves. It was a cruel practice, aimed at preserving the captain's profit, even at the cost of torturing people determined to die rather than live. After the morning rations, the crew would undertake their version of cleaning the hold. This often meant having enslaved people scrape and swab the decks, while still in chains, to remove some of the accumulated filth. Sand or vinegar might be sprinkled and scrubbed across blood or waste-stained planks. Yet, the deep foulness could never truly be cleansed during the voyage. The slave deck remained a hellish, filth-strewn place throughout. To avoid the worst build-up, some captains forced captives to use the necessary buckets on a schedule and had crewmen empty them frequently. But in rough weather or at night, the enslaved were sometimes not allowed above to relieve themselves at all, causing them to soil the cramped space. One more of the bizarre daily rituals on some ships was called dancing the slaves, a euphemism for forced exercise. Captains believed that making captives move would keep their muscles strong and perhaps lift their spirits enough to prevent mass death from despair. As a 1729 slave ship medical guide advised, the health of the voyage depended on dealing kindly with Africans, and often diverting them with the drum, dance, etc., in order to dissipate the sorrowful thoughts of quitting their own country. In practice, this dance was enforced by the whip. Each day, when weather allowed, small groups of shackled men were brought up to the main deck. Sailors armed with cat-o'-nine tails, a multi-lashed whip, or ropes would compel them to jump and stomp in whatever space they had, sometimes to the rhythm of a drum or fiddle. Those who refused to dance or were too weak were often flogged until they either complied or collapsed. Captors also encouraged the enslaved to sing during these exercises, though if they grew irritated, if the Africans sang mournful, defiant songs, the beatings would continue. They must appear cheerful. Cruel punishments were a constant of the slave ship regime. Any perceived defiance, not eating, not exercising, attempting to rest, could result in a lashing or any other form of abuse. Enslaved Africans were whipped with such frequency that many bore scars by journey's end, and some were even beaten to death as an example to others. Discipline aboard was maintained by terror. The enslaved were usually kept in chains and watched by armed guards at all times. Captains often had special manacles, leg irons, collars, and shackles made for the voyage. Men were chained in pairs, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle. Women were typically left unshackled but still confined below or kept under surveillance on deck. At night, gratings over the hatchways were locked to prevent anyone from coming up. Many ships also strung netting along the deck rails to make it harder for captives to leap into the sea. Some vessels even repositioned cannons to command the slave deck. Phillips, for instance, placed 2 of the Hannibal's guns pointing down through the hatch, ready to blast grape shot into the hold in case of an uprising. The crew had a cache of weapons at hand, muskets, pistols, cutlasses, sometimes even grenades. Captains and sailors regarded the Africans as potential threats as much as cargo. Indeed, as Phillips wrote, some captives were experienced warriors capable of plotting to take over the ship. The crew always remained alert and ruthless in preempting rebellion. Essentially, it was a floating prison camp under martial law. Amid this routine of controlled brutality, there were occasional attempts at rudimentary care or pragmatism. Occasional, that is. If individuals felt deathly ill, they might be brought on deck for fresh air or segregated to prevent contagion. For instance, smallpox victims were sometimes quarantined in a makeshift infirmary area. Equiano, being a child and gravely sick, was kept mostly on deck and spared constant chaining, which, happily, perhaps saved him from the fate of the adults below. Ship surgeons applied basic treatments, cleaning sores, bleeding fevers, giving doses of lime juice to prevent scurvy, mainly to protect the captain's investment. Any recovery was counted a gain. Those who died were written off. The crew's underlying attitude remained mercenary. As long as a captive could survive to be sold, he or she would be sustained, however minimally. The moment a captive was deemed a lost cause, irrevocably ill or injured, they may be summarily discarded to save food and space. Throughout the passage, the captives themselves sought ways to cope with the trauma. Some found strength in songs, prayers, or quiet solidarity. Officers' journals occasionally noted the enslaved people singing at night, often mournful lamentations that carried in the dark. Such songs likely allowed them to mourn together and preserve a piece of their cultural identity amid the chaos. When possible, those who shared a language or region tried to console each other and care for the more vulnerable. Mothers comforted children. Ship logs mention African women assisting ailing shipmates. These human gestures persisted, despite the dehumanized environment. Still, every act of camaraderie took place under the watchful eyes of the guards, quick to quash anything they feared might lead to collective action. While the male captives endured the harshest physical constraints, women and children aboard the ships faced their own set of horrors. Women were typically not chained in the hold and were allowed a degree of mobility on deck compared to men. Captains assumed women were less likely to foment rebellion. However, this relative freedom made women extremely vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Contemporary witnesses, including ship surgeons and enslaved survivors, confirmed that assault of African women by sailors was commonplace. Enslaved women and girls, seen as property, had no recourse against the advances of crewmen. Officers sometimes explicitly selected a woman as a concubine for the voyage. One account by a ship's doctor described how crew members would drag women screeching from below at night. The victims of such assaults were left traumatized, and if they resisted, they could be beaten or even killed with impunity. There were no laws or ship rules to protect them. They were treated simply as another spoil of the trade. But despite these dangers, they could also play their roles in resistance. We'll see it in the next section. They sometimes used their relative freedom to communicate between the groups of male captives, or to make small makeshift weapons or tools that men could use in a revolt. Women also had to maintain whatever care they could for the children present. Children, of course, were generally not shackled, and those old enough to walk might move around the ship freely during the day. Crew members often viewed African children with a mix of amusement and indifference. They were less valuable cargo. Very young children might sell for lower prices, but they also posed no threat. Older enslaved children sometimes assisted the crew with minor tasks, perhaps to earn small favors or food morsels. Younger children clung to their mothers or other adults. Mothers did their best to soothe the crying infants amid the foul conditions. Some women even risked punishment to obtain a bit of extra food or water for their little ones. And even tragically, some enslaved women were forced to give birth during the voyage. In such instances, both mother and newborn were in grave danger due to the lack of medical care and the unsanitary environment. One famous formerly enslaved man, Ignatius Sancho, was born on a slave ship in 1729. His mother died soon after giving birth. His father, in despair, chose to take his own life. This was not an isolated case. Ship logs occasionally recorded stillbirths or infants born at sea who lived only a short time. If a mother died in childbirth, the crew might throw her infant overboard alive, rather than spare resources on an infant unlikely to survive. Such cruel actions underscore the utter commodification of those on board. The psychological torment for women was acute. They had witnessed their villages attacked, their families torn apart. Now at sea, they endured both the general misery of the hold and the personal terror of exploitation. Some women found ways to fight back. There are accounts of enslaved women attacking predatory sailors, scratching, biting, even stabbing them with utensils, though such resistance was usually met with lethal retaliation from the crew. Yet it sometimes took other forms. They might encourage men to revolt, or conceal plans from the inquisitive crew. In a few recorded instances, women committed infanticide or took their own life as an act of defiance. For example, mothers who smothered their infants or jumped overboard with children rather than let them live as slaves. Each woman's experience was unique, but collectively, enslaved women had to endure a burdensome dual role, victims of the same brutal regime of the men, and the additional victims of violence and family devastation. And so, faced with relentless cruelty, the enslaved Africans did not uniformly submit. Many resisted in whatever ways they could, ranging from quiet defiance to all-out rebellion. Despair, however, was pervasive. Some captives sought to simply take their own lives instead, and many did. In the terminology of the time, crews reported individuals dying of melancholy, essentially severe depression, leading to the loss of will to live. Some captives simply refused to eat until they wasted away, despite beatings and force-feeding attempts. Others attempted more direct ends to their suffering. There were numerous cases of Africans jumping overboard to drown. Equiano recounts how two of his fellow captives chained together managed to slip through the netting and leap into the sea. How they, quote, preferred death to such a life of misery. A third man, unshackled due to illness, followed them overboard. The crew sprang into action, stopping the ship and launching a small boat. But at least 2 of the 3 escapees drowned before they could be recovered. Enslaved people understood that the ocean offered an escape from torment. Some even believed that their souls would return to Africa if they died at sea. To deter such incidences, crews put up nettings and barriers and kept close watch. Yet the desperate captives still found their opportunities where they could. On some voyages, multiple people jumped to their deaths. In one notorious incident in 1776, a group of enslaved men deliberately drowned themselves by leaping from a ship off Jamaica, refusing to accept their fate as slaves. Contemporaries noted that these attempts were thousands in number over the centuries of the trade. Beyond individual acts, enslaved Africans regularly plotted revolts aboard slave ships. Shipboard revolts were especially common while the vessel was still near to the African coast, as captives saw a chance to ally with others on shore or swim to land. Over time, shipbuilders and captains modified vessels specifically to thwart rebellion, with reinforced hatch gratings, barricades, and weapons at the ready. The crew were constantly on guard. Any hint of uprising would prompt brutal, preemptive action. Still, history records dozens of slave ship rebellions. A ship's journal from June of 1770 off the coast of West Africa documents a series of revolt attempts within 1 month. It goes as follows. 6th of June, 1770. The slaves made an insurrection, which was soon quelled, with the loss of 2 women. 23rd of June. Died a girl slave. Number 13. The slaves attempted an insurrection, lost a man of Captain Montpenny's purchase, who jumped overboard and was drowned. Employed securing the men in chains, and gave the women concerned 24 lashes each. 26th of June. A few of them got off their handcuffs, but were detected in time. 27th of June. The slaves attempted to force up the gratings in the night, with a design to murder the whites or drown themselves. The women as well as the men were determined, if disappointed of cutting off the whites, to jump overboard and burn the ship as a last resort. Their obstinacy put me under necessity of shooting the ringleader. End of the log entries. Well, this all happened in a single voyage. Definitely getting more than what they bargained for, trying to keep them all below deck. It shows that the captives persistently resisted and were willing to risk death for a chance at freedom, or at least to get their own back. So when a mutiny erupted, the crew responded with overwhelming force. Sailors used swords, firearms, and whatever means necessary to suppress rebellion. Those Africans who survived a failed revolt faced savage punishment. It was common for ringleaders to be executed on spot, for example by shooting or hanging, with all the other captives being made to watch. Some were thrown alive to the sharks as both punishment and a terror tactic. Others might be tortured or mutilated. There are accounts of crews cutting off the limbs of captured rebel leaders, or forcing the remaining captives to watch as their bodies were dragged behind the ship. These gruesome reprisals were meant to crush any further thought of resistance. Now, ironically, the financial loss from killing slaves in a revolt could be mitigated by insurance. European insurers often covered losses from insurrection or, quote, perils of the sea, effectively reimbursing slave owners for dead captives. In one Dutch insurance policy of 1770, a cause explicitly compensated owners for slaves lost to revolt or thrown overboard. This practice only reinforced the view of enslaved people as expendable. But perhaps the most infamous example of cruelty and calculated murder at sea is the case of the British slave ship Zong in 1781. The Zong was overloaded with slaves, around 440 of them on board, on a voyage from West Africa to Jamaica. Disease and malnutrition began killing captives and crew alike as the ship entered the calm equatorial waters known as the doldrums. Facing a shortage of portable water, Captain Luke Collingwood made a horrific decision. He resolved to jettison some of the cargo and save supplies. And by cargo, he means the slaves. Of course, he would then just claim insurance compensation for the loss. Over several days, in late November 1781, the crew disposed of 132 enslaved Africans, throwing them overboard. These were people deemed too sick to survive, or just too thin to fetch a good price. Another 10 captives, in a final act of defiance, jumped into the sea rather than be cast over. The captain later noted quite cynically that it was a loss due to an act of obstinacy on their part. In total, about 142 Africans were gone. When the Zong reached port in Black River, Jamaica, the ship's owners filed an insurance claim for the value of 132 slaves who had been thrown overboard. The subsequent legal case in England, Gregson versus Gilbert, initially treated the matter as a routine insurance dispute, essentially ruling that a captain could lawfully dispose of cargo in emergencies. It was only after the abolitionist Granville Sharp publicized the case that the British public began to grasp the inhumanity that it laid bare. The Zong massacre epitomizes the utter devaluation of African life in the slave trade, One later depiction of such an atrocity appeared in an American abolitionist newspaper in 1832, showing a captain on a Brazilian slaver having sick Africans thrown overboard to avoid import duties, calmly treating people as disposable commodities. As commentators noted, it was the profit motive taken to a murderous extreme, an attitude that regarded enslaved people as worth more dead via insurance or cost saving than alive in the most certain moments. This simultaneous objectification of people and disdain for their lives allowed many crews to wantonly discard human beings without a hint of remorse. And they did. And so, after weeks, perhaps even months at sea, typically a 6 to 8 week crossing in the 18th century, though sometimes much longer, the survivors of the Middle Passage finally saw land on the horizon. For better or worse, we don't really know. By the time a slave ship approached the Americas, those still alive were often emaciated, dehydrated, and ill. Their ordeal did not end on reaching port, however. The captives would now be prepared for sale, just like any other product arriving in a market. As soon as the ship docked or anchored, the crew got busy bringing the enslaved on deck and began efforts to improve their appearance. They were usually washed with buckets of seawater or taken to shore and bathed. After months in close confinement, many had skin covered with grime, sores, or salt from dried sweat. The crew shaved the men's faces, sometimes their heads, to make them look younger and healthier. Bodies were rubbed with a palm oil or grease to hide blemishes and give the skin a sheen of vitality. If a person had wounds or ulcers, these might be filled with hot tar as a crude cosmetic treatment to cover raw flesh. In some cases, dye was applied to hair to cover any graying, and ruptures, being from hernias or from strain or injury, were trussed up with bandages to prevent any obvious bulges. These preparations were all aimed at fetching the highest possible price at auction. The more marketable the product seemed, the more you could sell it for that higher price. And of course, it was all about getting the highest possible price. And so, like that, all of the slaves, as best as they could, were prepared. On shore, slave traders separated the captives by category. Now the categories were somewhat as follows. The prime slaves, typically young adult males who looked nice and healthy and strong, were isolated for prominent auction display. Of course, these would be the strongest workers. The slaves were there to do the heavy lifting, so the stronger and taller someone would be, the better slave they would be for the one who purchases them. As for the women and the adolescent youths, they were grouped, and small children who appeared weak were set aside. Sometimes a doctor or an assessor would examine the captives, poking and prodding to judge their condition, and assigning them arbitrary values. Think about giving them classifications such as first-class slaves and second-class slaves, this kind of thing. And then came the sale itself, often a public auction or a so-called scramble. At auctions, buyers scrutinized the Africans as much as the crew had done back on the coast of Africa, forcing mouths open to check teeth, feeling limbs, and making the enslaved walk or jump to assess their fitness, sometimes making them lift heavy things, a kind of test run of some of the work they would be doing for the customer. Families that had managed to stay together through the voyage were frequently torn apart at this stage, as different buyers bid on individuals, and it was very rare that they would purchase a whole family together. One eyewitness in the Caribbean described children clinging to their mothers when they realized they were about to be sold separately, only to be dragged away by the new owners amidst heart-rending screams. Many newly arrived captives were so weakened that they died soon after arrival. In fact, plantation societies like Brazil and the Caribbean, a significant percentage of imported Africans perished in their first year, a period grimly referred to as the seasoning time. They succumbed to new diseases, which of course they had zero immunity to, things like yellow fever and all the rest, little surprises that the new world had in store for them, or to the compounded effects of malnutrition and the abuses suffered during the Middle Passage. Plantation owners took this high early mortality for granted, viewing the fresh imports as replaceable units that might not all survive long. In North America, where conditions were somewhat less lethal, newly arrived Africans still faced a tremendous adjustment, and often carried lasting scars, physical and psychological, from the voyage. For every individual, the transition from the nightmare at sea to the harsh reality of slavery on land was yet another profound shock. The Middle Passage was over, but the long journey into bondage continued on foreign soil in a foreign world. Pretty horrifying from start to finish, I'm sure you'll agree. Well, to wrap all this up, the experience of the enslaved people aboard the slave ship could be one of the most horrific chapters in history. It's definitely up there. It must be top 5. The Middle Passage subjected millions to extreme overcrowding, violence, disease, and don't forget the psychological terror. Why? To make money. That's all it was. They just wanted to make money. Well, not good at all. We have heard in the words of those who endured it, how the holds of the slave ships became airless, pestilential dungeons, filled with loathsome filth and utter despair. We've seen through ship logs and accounts how captains treated human lives as units of profit, chaining, flogging, and even randomly killing them with impunity. And yet, even in the depths of this floating prison of depravity, enslaved people did their best to resist and assert their humanity, whether through open revolt or simple acts of singing a lament together in the dark. By examining the Middle Passage through all the sources in the first-hand testimony, we avoid sanitizing the past. The facts speak plainly. The slave trade was a human disaster on a vast scale, fueled by greed, maintained by terror. Its broad geographical scope, spanning Africa, the Americas, and Europe, meant that the legacy of this violence is global. Understanding what enslaved people endured on the ships is essential to understanding the history of what's going on with the diaspora and the enduring impact of slavery. Well, unfortunately, there's still plenty of slaves around. We might have banned the practice in the civilized world, but it's still happening in other parts of the world. Well, hopefully we can bring all that to an end soon. It's largely thanks to the testimony of survivors, though, like Equiano, and even the records of the slave traders themselves, that we can even talk about this grim reality and reconstruct it so many years later. I hope that I've presented a factual and unembellished narrative of that experience. I'll let the brutal realities speak for themselves. The emotional weight of the Middle Passage doesn't come from rhetoric, but it comes from the real cries and sufferings recorded in those historical sources, in bearing witness to their ordeal, even at a remove of centuries. We have to acknowledge the true human cost of the trade, ensure that the victims' experiences are never forgotten. In the decades before the Civil War, cotton plantations of the Deep South depended on the forced labor of slaves. By 1860, cotton was the backbone of the Southern economy, and enslaved people numbered in the hundreds of thousands in states like Alabama and Mississippi. On plantations across the fertile Black Belt, enslaved men, women, and even children toiled from dawn until dark to feed the demand for cotton. Their daily existence was ruled by the rising and setting of the sun, the whims of the overseers, and the draconian laws of their system. Today's analysis is going to draw on some primary sources: slave narratives, interviews, plantation records. We're going to examine how enslaved people lived out their daily routines, dealt with the work conditions, the punishment, even a little bit about family life, and how they coped under this system. We're going to look at different slave journals and try and piece together how a daily routine would go, at least as much as we can. So first, let me welcome you here. It's good to meet you all. If you're new to the channel, I invite you to, while enjoying the content, click the subscribe button. And if you're returning, it's good to see you again. For those who are supporting on the Patreon, thank you once more. With that out of the way and welcomes all said and done, let's get on to the topic for today. As usual, nice and relaxed. Let's take it slow. First, we'll talk about the daily routine on a plantation. Enslaved field hands on cotton plantations led lives strictly governed by the demands of the cotton crop. A typical day would begin before sunrise. On many plantations, the horn or bell sounded in the pre-dawn darkness. That was the signal for the slaves to awaken and get to work. James Williams, who had been a slave driver on an Alabama cotton plantation in the 1830s, described it like this: at the earliest dawn of day, the slaves were awakened by the blasting of a horn. Some tried to rise earlier, to eat a small morsel, the morning's bit of bread or bacon, but if anyone overslept until the horn sounded, they had no time to snatch a mouthful before being driven out to the fields. Once the workday's signal was given, the slaves had to assemble and proceed to their task without a moment's delay. On cotton plantations, this meant heading to the fields as soon as there was enough gray light to distinguish the cotton plants from the weeds. Overseers or drivers distributed tools every morning: plows, hoes, cotton sacks, and every slave took their assigned place in the field rows. And then there were children. The ones who were too young for field work were left behind in the quarters, under the care of an elderly woman, often called a granny or the plantation nurse. They would mind the infants and toddlers, while their parents got to work in the fields. It was a kind of a crude daycare system. It allowed planters to extract a little bit more labor from mothers shortly after childbirth, too, even as nursing women were expected back in the field, with only brief intervals to feed their children mid-morning. Think about it. If you have several female slaves who have given birth, that might mean several people off work. But if you just have one system of daycare, if we're going to put it in that way, well, one woman can look after all of the children. This means more hands. The field labor on a cotton plantation stretched from first light until sundown. often 12 to 14 hours of continuous toil. Of course, this would depend on the strictness of the masters. Some masters did not treat their slaves so harshly, viewing them more as workers who needed to be looked after a little better. We'll get to that a little bit later. Sometimes work hours could go a little bit longer during harvest time, overtime, that kind of thing. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Solomon Northup, the subject of the film 12 Years a Slave and the writer of the diary of the same name. He endured 12 years of enslavement on Louisiana plantations, and he wrote that slaves were required to be in the cotton field as soon as it is light in the morning, and aside from a short midday break, they are not permitted to be a moment idle, until it is simply too dark to see. One Alabama bondsman likewise recalled that the overseer would get slaves up before day blowing his big horn, and us would work twell plumb dark. The labor did not necessarily stop even when daylight faded. In peak harvest season, work extended into the night. Solomon Northup noted that when the moon was full, sometimes they labored as long as the clouds would allow them. Around noon usually came a brief stop for a meager meal. Often it was no more than a few minutes to gulp down cold bacon before the horn called them back to the field. After this hurried lunch, the grueling field work resumed for the rest of the afternoon under the blazing sun. Enslaved people chopped weeds with heavy hoes, guided mule-drawn plows, or in the harvest seasons, picked cotton balls and stuffed them into long sacks, slinging them over their shoulders. Of course, the work was not only back-breaking, but also monotonous. All this while requiring a constant speed and rhythm. And that's where the drivers came in. You know where we get the word slave driver. Well, it'll take on a little bit of a more literal meaning with this talk. Drivers like James Williams moved up and down the rows to urge the laborers forward, with threats of lashes if anybody was lagging, under the overseer's watchful eye, often from horseback with whip in hand. The line of slaves had to keep bending, chopping, picking in unison. No excuses, no slacking. He was reported as saying as following: I was employed in passing from row to row in order to see that the work was well done and to urge forward the laborers. Of course, you must remember that he was coerced in his role as a driver. Falling behind could mean a beating on the spot. Sundown did not mean the end. Daylight faded. The field hands were finally permitted to stop field work and leave, often carrying their tools and baskets. But the day's duties were not truly over. First they had to tote their harvested cotton to the gin house or cotton shed to be weighed and stored. At day's end, each slave had to bring their filled cotton basket to be weighed at the gin house, a moment always approached with fear and trembling. Why would that be? Well, you see, the slaves often had quotas. If a slave fell short of that daily quota, they may suffer a punishment on the spot. If they exceeded it, the master might simply just raise the quota for the next time, viewing them as a good worker, capable of more. A kind of bizarre motivation. After weighing and storing the cotton, the slaves still had to perform their evening chores around the farm, and that could mean all sorts of jobs. Cutting firewood, feeding mules, fetching water, and so on, depending on what kind of skills and strength the particular slave had. Only after completing these duties would they finally trudge back to their meager quarters. But even so, you didn't get too much rest in there. When slaves at last reached their cabins, They still had to tend to their own basic needs, and their own basic needs, of course, had been postponed all day. They might have to grind corn into meal by hand on a crude hand mill to prepare their food, and then cook whatever meager supply they had, typically over an open hearth. Women in particular had to spend hours at night carding cotton or spinning yarn, to finish cloth for their clothing. Many had spinning quotas to fulfill on top of a day's field work, under threat of punishment if they failed to finish. Some slaves also attended to small garden patches or chickens at night to supplement their meager rations. After only a few hours of rest, the unwelcome horn would sound again, and the cycle would begin all anew. The exhaustion was, of course, profound as one can imagine. Even Sunday, the slave's supposed day of rest, often had to be used to finish the leftover tasks or personal chores. If you didn't get that done, Monday might have a whipping in store for you. Although it did offer a brief chance for worship or family time in many cases. So this gives us a bit of a picture of the average sort of routine, of course. Different places had different things going on. Some worse, some better. It all depends on the management. Just like a normal workplace in our modern era. So let's talk a little bit more about the work conditions now. The daily routine in itself was grueling, but the conditions under which enslaved people labored made it even more brutal. Enslaved workers on cotton plantations faced relentless physical demands, along with inadequate provisions and poor environments designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost. Contemporary accounts highlight the extreme fatigue and suffering that pervaded the work experience of field slaves. Planters enforced high productivity from each hand. An ordinary day's picking was about 200 pounds of cotton, and any slave who brought in less was typically punished. A new hand's capability was tested on their first day. Overseers would whip him up smartly to pick up the pace as much as possible, then require an amount every day thereafter. If any day's weight fell short, it was considered evidence that he had been laggard. A number of lashes could be the penalty. Each person thus had a fixed quota under the constant threat of the whip. Exceptional pickers, like one young woman on Northup's plantation, could gather as much as 500 pounds in a single day. You'd think this would be rewarded, surely. But rather than actually rewarding her, the master simply expected feats regularly such as this, and according to Northup, she would surely have been beaten if she fell below that extraordinary mark. Slaves who consistently could not meet the standard quota might be reallocated to other work, such as stock tending or carpentry, rather than whipped daily for shortfall. Beyond cotton picking, many other tasks filled an enslaved person's workday. In spring, slaves plowed the fields and planted seed from sunup to sundown. In summer, they thinned the cotton and hoed weeds under a punishing sun. Many suffered from heat exhaustion. Those not acclimated to the deep south climate sometimes collapsed under the extreme heat and severity of the toil. Overseers were often quite indifferent to the suffering. One even joked that fainting newcomers were Virginia ladies, altogether too delicate for Alabama use, yet he still drove them until collapse. The constant threats were dehydration, malaria, and sunstroke. Slaves were often given no hats or inadequate shoes, and their coarse clothing offered pretty much no protection from sun or rain. Fevers and illnesses were also frequent, and medical care was primitive if you could get it at all, typically limited to home remedies or just a good rest if that was allowed. Planters were provided just enough food to keep the slaves working, but also keep them somewhat well nourished, if they could afford that. Weekly rations were pretty meager generally, typically a peck of cornmeal and 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork or bacon per person. This might be cooked into cornmeal mush or cornbread in a thin pork stew. Slaves rarely received vegetables, milk, or other foods from the plantation stores. To avoid starvation, many enslaved people cultivated small garden patches by their cabins, or foraged and hunted at night to supplement their diet. But even so, chronic hunger and malnutrition were common. One enslaved woman recalled the standard fare was 3 pounds of meat and a peck of meal per week. Very little else. Clothing, on the other hand, was issued sparingly, usually once or twice a year, and was the cheapest and coarsest fabric. Onseberg, not sure if you heard of that. It's been a while since that has been on the shelves. It was a rough linen, commonly used for slave garments. Adults might receive a single outfit for summer, shirt and pants for men, a dress for women, and one for winter, plus maybe a coat and a pair of shoes. The pair of shoes, you had to be pretty lucky to get them, though. Children frequently went without proper clothing. Many wore nothing more than a long shirt tail until adolescence. Bedding was likewise minimal. An enslaved person typically got 1 coarse blanket per year, and they slept on wooden planks or the cabin floor with straw or rags for padding. Housing for enslaved families usually consisted of crude one-room log cabins in an area called the slave quarters. These cabins were rudimentary structures, often without windows, with dirt floors and leaky roofs. Multiple family members slept together in such cramped quarters. Little privacy or comfort. James Williams, from his journal, noted that slave cabins on his Alabama plantation each had a piece of ground attached to them for a garden, where the occupant could try to raise a few vegetables. There was a catch, though. The slaves could usually tend these gardens only at night or on Sundays, and that is, of course, up to the exhausting work days. The quarters were generally within earshot of the overseer's master's house. Williams said it was 300 yards away. If you got caught, well, out comes the whip. And then what was the situation for health and medical care? We've briefly mentioned it. Given the long hours, exposure, and poor diet, one may imagine that people often fell ill or suffered injuries. However, medical care was grossly inadequate. Planters rarely summoned doctors, except in extreme cases. Instead, sick slaves were usually treated with crude home remedies or just left to recover or just die on their own. Enslaved individuals were expected to work through common illnesses like fevers, and resting was often not tolerated unless a person was on the brink of collapse. Pregnant women often received no special consideration. They were expected to work up until childbirth, and many miscarriages or stillbirths resulted from overwork and abuse. There was one particularly horrific case in Alabama. An overseer whipped a heavily pregnant woman named Priscilla until, quote, she was delivered of a dead infant at the foot of a tree where she was tied. Now that is tragic. It was apparently reported in the same source. The overseer had later laughed it off as a small incident. Things like this to show that enslavers generally viewed slaves only as laboring property, not as humans to be cared for. But when they did receive medical care, it was usually under the guise of not wanting to lose one's investment. Think about it. A plantation owner, a slaver, someone who would purchase slaves. Well, if he was going to pay a certain amount of money for a slave, he didn't want that person to succumb to some illness who could be cured quite easily. So it really would depend on the situation. But generally, you would just be told to get over it. Let's get into a little bit more about punishments and control. I know, it's not like we're moving into brighter territory, but, well, you knew what you were in for when you clicked on the video. Plantation slavery was, of course, maintained by this underlying threat of violence and punishment. Enslaved people were subject to brutal physical discipline for a host of real and sometimes perceived infractions, or simply just to enforce total control. First-hand accounts provide pretty stomach-churning details of whippings, torture, and other abuses that were part of life for slaves in the Deep South cotton plantations. We've certainly seen the videos of the torn and ripped up backs of some former slaves. Horrifying. Of course, that was the job of the whip, the planter's primary tool of discipline. It was often made of braided cowhide. It could flay your back to ribbons. It was used so commonly that countless slaves bore permanent scars crisscrossing on their backs. The standard severe whipping was often set at 39 lashes. By custom, and some state laws even codified 39 as a limit. But overseers frequently exceeded that limit with impunity. Whippings were administered for endless reasons. Failing to meet the daily picking quota was a frequent cause. Northup had noted in his writings, after weighing, following the whippings for those who fell short. There was a scene actually in that film when they're all weighing the cotton hoard at the end of the day, and very casually the master, well, after measuring and finding a certain weight to be inaccurate, just nonchalantly says, "Okay, take them away to be whipped." Poor old slaves just, well, I suppose it happens so many times that they just get used to it, as much as you could. In fact, the slaves might also be flogged for any perceived disrespect, slowing down, breaking a tool by accident, or even in some cases just having a sullen expression, a bad attitude. Punishments were often inflicted publicly as a warning to others. Enslavers devised other cruel punishments too beyond whipping. Some enslaved people were confined in shackles or iron collars for days. Others were put in the stocks, that medieval-looking wooden frame, sort of sits around your hands and feet, sometimes, or just with your head and your hands through it. And that is a punishment that's pretty severe. One Alabama slave was actually left in stocks for days, and he actually died in there, the poor thing. Torture also was not uncommon. James Williams recounted an overseer tying a runaway to the ground and using trained cats to claw his back. How grotesque. In another case, an overseer punished an enslaved man by burning him with hot wax, illustrating the sadistic lengths of the cruelty. Of course, always under the constant threat of such brutality. The threat of death, or sale, also loomed as ultimate punishments. If a slave resisted or struck back, they could be killed with very little repercussion. More commonly, rebellious slaves were sold off to the Deep South trade as a punishment, permanently exiling them from their family. Family separations were themselves a deliberate, controlled tactic. The wife or child of a disobedient slave might be sold away to break the slave's spirit. As one 1830s anti-slavery report lamented, quote, "Brothers and sisters, parents and children, husbands and wives are torn asunder and permitted to see each other no more. These acts are daily occurring in the midst of us." The constant fear of being whipped, maimed, or sold, that was a psychological terror. One of the most horrific punishments was reserved for runaways, if people had the guts to try it. Many did, though. Last resorts, a lot of them were driven to that. Plantation owners employed armed patrols and packs of trained bloodhounds to hunt fugitive slaves. If they were caught, runaways would be savagely whipped, mutilated, or even just killed as examples. James Williams recounts how a man named Little John ran off and was pursued by hounds. Well, guess what? They found him. His body was, I quote, dreadfully mangled and gashed by the teeth of the dogs, entrails strewn about. Such ghastly scenes were extreme, sure, and they didn't happen too often, but they weren't unheard of. Even the possibility of being torn apart by dogs or killed for trying to escape cast a very long shadow, deterring many from attempting flight. Overseers were the paid enforcers of this brutal regime, and it was very hard to find somebody to do that job. Often poor whites were hired for their toughness, and they had a reputation for cruelty. They wielded virtually unchecked power on the plantation, answerable only to the master. William's overseer in Alabama, a man named Huckstep, became notorious for his violent discipline. He even whipped that pregnant Priscilla until she miscarried. Huckstep's reign of terror was such that when he was badly injured in a horse accident, the slaves secretly rejoiced, reportedly thanking God that the devil would take him at last. Such a rare glimpse into slave sentiment shows how deeply hated a cruel overseer can be. Well, to sum up, the slave system relied on this spectrum of punishments: daily whipping and humiliation up to torture, killing and family destruction to enforce submission. Enslaved people lived under a state of siege, physical and psychological, never knowing when the next act of cruelty might occur. That many survived it all under these kinds of conditions, it must be a testament to resilience, that's for sure, even as countless others perished or were simply broken by the brutality of it all. But of course, among all the misery, life must go on. Despite all the dehumanization, the slaves formed families and communities, creating a social world of their own within the confines of their system. However, family life under slavery was, as you can imagine, fraught with anxiety and heartbreak. They could get married, sure, but the marriages had no legal standing. Families could be torn apart at a slaveholder's whim, and even every family bond was vulnerable to the slave trade breaking it apart. Slaves did marry, or take up at least with a partner, and strove to maintain family units as much as possible, often held informal marriage ceremonies. A common tradition was jumping the broom. The couple would jump over a broomstick together as a symbol of union. Typically, they had to get the master's permission to marry or live as husband and wife. Some owners allowed it, too, seeing advantage in slaves having families. Children born into slavery increased the owner's human property, too. And some owners just wanted to treat their slaves a little bit more humanely. Once again, it really depends on the person. We can't imagine that every single slave owner was a monstrous, Disney-like villain. I know that's a controversial opinion, but we just cannot put things into such simplified terms, because it all comes on a spectrum. Well, either way, this permission to get married could be denied or revoked arbitrarily. There was one ex-slave that recalled that you couldn't marry unless another master's agreed to buy both of them, meaning that if a husband and wife had different owners, one owner had to purchase the other, or the marriage would just simply not be allowed. Too bad. So sad. If such an agreement wasn't reached, couples might simply cohabitate without any formal sanction, or maintain a marriage across plantations through nightly visits when possible. Enslaved couples cherished their bonds despite all these obstacles. Human feelings don't go away, even in times of trouble. They considered themselves married in the eyes of God, even if they weren't recognized by law. Slaves often sought to live together as families in their quarters, as many slaveholders did tolerate nuclear families on their plantations, as long as the slaves remained obedient. Some masters found that allowing family life could make slaves more docile. However, the threat of separation always hung over them. The husband on one plantation often lived in fear that his wife or children might be sold, while he was powerless to prevent it, and of course vice versa. For enslaved mothers and fathers, parenthood was a mix of both joy and terror. Like everyone else, they loved their children dearly, but they knew they were raising them under constant peril. Slave infants were typically allowed to stay with their mothers until weaning, but after that, they could be sold at any time. Harriet Ann Jacobs, an enslaved mother herself, described how every New Year's Day, the traditional hiring and sale day for slaves, comes laden with peculiar sorrows for slave mothers, who sit watching the children, who may all be torn from her the next morning. Jacobs witnessed a mother of 7 in North Carolina lose every single one of her children in the same tragic day. The woman was screaming at the auction, according to Jacobs. They took all. Gone. All gone. Why doesn't God kill me? As her last child was carted away. Jesus. Such scenes were daily, hourly occurrences. Jacobs attested to this. Every enslaved parent in Alabama or Mississippi knew that their family could be broken apart with the stroke of a pen on a bill of sale. Enslaved mothers tried to shield their children as best as they could. They taught them to be discreet and obedient around the masters from a young age, hoping to spare them from punishment. Mothers and fathers also passed down African-American folk stories, songs, and spiritual beliefs to instill strength and a kind of identity in their children. Many slaves gave their children biblical or familial names, even if the masters assigned them different names, as a way to assert their personhood. Nonetheless, parents had to live with that painful knowledge that they ultimately had no legal right to keep their own daughters or their own sons. A slave child was the property of the master, not their parents. As one formerly enslaved person bitterly remarked, slave parents lived with a peculiar sorrow. They could not protect their offspring from being sold or abused. Extended family and community. In response to these pressures, enslaved people developed extended kin networks and communal support systems. Everyone in the slave quarters became kind of a big old family. Older slaves helped care for the young. An elder might be called an auntie or an uncle by all of the children, whether related or not. If an infant's mother was sold away, another enslaved woman on the plantation would often nurse and raise the child as her own. The slaves took these adoptive bonds very seriously. It wasn't uncommon for aunts, uncles, or even grandparents to step in to rear children separated from their parents. Someone had to step up. These adaptive family structures helped a little bit to offset the trauma of family separations and foster a sense of solidarity in the quarters. If your children were taken away from you, hopefully there would be a good chance that they were simply being sent to their auntie's house. But despite the slaveholders' efforts to suppress them, enslaved people also built their own community life and cultural traditions. In slave quarters at night, they forged a semi-autonomous social world. They sang spirituals and work songs that expressed their hopes and sorrows in coded language among themselves. They told folk tales that taught lessons about surviving by wit and guile. On rare evenings or Saturday nights, they held informal dances or prayer meetings. One former slave from Alabama recalled that on some Saturday nights the slaves would sing and dance and have prayer meetings in their quarters. Another remembered how on special nights they had lots of fun, cutting monkey shines and dancing all night long. Sometimes even the plantation mistress would quietly watch the slaves dance for a while. Such gatherings allowed enslaved people to enjoy fellowship and at least forget their cares for a little while. They laughed, celebrated marriages, and told jokes about the masters behind their backs, most likely, forging a shared culture and identity that the slaveholders could never really whip out of them. But perhaps most remarkably, enslaved people continued to form and cherish family bonds under slavery's assaults. Many couples stayed together for life, even if they were not separated by sale. They considered their anniversary of jumping the broom as meaningful as a legal wedding. Parents clung fiercely as their children as they could. Family members were sold away, often attempted to maintain contact by sending letters through clandestine means or relayed messages via traveling slaves. After the Civil War, thousands of freed people would embark on journeys to try and reunite with long-lost spouses, children, or siblings. In summary, family life for slaves was pretty fragile, often tragically disrupted, yet never fully extinguished. Enslaved people asserted their humanity by loving one another, marrying and nurturing children under conditions that sought to deny those very human impulses. The family and community they built in quarters provided emotional support, cultural continuity, and a form of resistance to the idea that they were simply property. These ties sustained them through the darkest of times, even as the institution of slavery constantly threatened to tear their loved ones apart. As one formerly enslaved mother had recalled, "They can't chain my soul to earth." Even when her children were sold, she kept them alive in her heart until the hoped-for day of their freedom and reunion came. Resistance and survival. Faced with unrelenting toil and brutality, enslaved individuals developed various survival strategies and forms of resistance, some subtle and everyday, and oftentimes bold and extraordinary. These included quiet subversions on the plantation, cultural and spiritual sustenance, and occasionally open defiance or escape. Together they helped enslaved people preserve their dignity and hope. On a daily basis, enslaved people engaged in small acts to assert some control or at least slow the pace of exploitation. They sometimes faked illness, accidentally broke tools, or more slowly, they worked more worked more slowly than they were capable of, a practice known as foot dragging as a form of protest. An enslaved worker might, for example, deliberately let a plow ox wander off or a cotton branch get damaged whenever the overseer wasn't looking, in order to disrupt the workflow. Such acts had to be subtle. If you got caught, well, you'd be punished severely. But many slaves became very adept at just feigning stupidity or clumsiness to cover minor sabotage. They also stole bits of produce or supplies from the plantation, what one slave called taking back what was owed to supplement their own needs, despite the risk of a whipping if you got discovered. Even maintaining one's dignity could be a form of defiance. Some slaves refused to show pain or cry out under the lash, denying their tormentors the satisfaction of it. Others found different ways to assert personality, wearing bright colors on their ragged clothes, celebrating secret birthdays for their kids, or giving their children dignified names. Such behaviors might seem pretty minor, but they were actually real acts of self-assertion in a system that tried to strip away their individuality. And then there were religion and music. They were crucial coping tools. Enslaved people crafted a rich spiritual life that gave them hope and inner freedom. They held secret prayer meetings at night. One remembered turning a washpot upside down at the cabin door to muffle the sound of their hymns so the master wouldn't hear it. In their humble, brash arbors of slave quarters, they sang spirituals that often had double meanings, praising God while yearning for deliverance from bondage. The biblical story of Exodus, that is, that escape from slavery, well, that was especially inspiring. When they sang the song, "Go Down, Moses," or even "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," they were affirming their faith that one day all of God's children would be free. This faith gave them strength to endure the suffering. As an ex-slave in Mississippi put it, "We prayed that the Lord would set us free. We know that he would, in his own time." Music thus lifted their spirits. Enslaved people sang while working, during worship, and in their few leisure moments. These songs expressed sorrow, hope, and sometimes veiled protest. Owners often thought the slaves were singing from happiness, but as Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, famously observed, slaves sang most when they were most unhappy, pouring out their souls in melody. You ever wonder where the blues comes from? Think about it. Work songs and spirituals were a form of emotional release and a way to forge solidarity in the quarters. Similarly, slaves told Brer Rabbit folk tales and other stories in the evenings, in which the weak tricked the strong, allegories that gave them laughter, and a sense that cleverness could overcome brute power. They survived in large part by supporting one another. In the slave quarters there was a strong ethic of sharing and cooperation. If someone fell ill or was injured, neighbors would help tend to them with herbal remedies. If a family ran short of food before the weekly ration was distributed, others might quietly share from their own provision. Women often assisted each other with childcare, for instance. A mother would watch over several toddlers while the others were in the field. Enslaved people also secretly helped each other meet onerous tasks. An elderly ex-slave recalled staying up late many nights to help her daughter spin the required amount of yarn so the daughter wouldn't be whipped for failing to meet the quota. These small acts of solidarity were a lifeline. Together, the slaves created a hidden support network, helping its members endure the hardship that would have been unbearable in isolation. But the most dramatic form of resistance was escape. Thousands of enslaved people attempted to flee, even though the odds were completely against them, especially from the deep south, where free territory was hundreds of miles away. Some runaways, or as they were called, truants, only hid out temporarily in nearby swamps or woods to escape punishment or overwork, returning after a few days or weeks when hunger or cold forced them back, or when an owner promised leniency. Others made daring bids for permanent freedom. One well-known Alabama fugitive, a man named James Curry, managed to disguise himself and travel north to freedom in the 1830s, later writing about his own escape. More commonly, Deep South runaways tried to reach cities like New Orleans or Mobile to stow away on ships. or they headed west toward the frontier, or south toward Mexico. In fact, slavery was non-existent in Mexico after 1829. Yeah, it kind of ties into the problems that they had with the Texas Revolution as well. It's cultural clashes. Well, most of these who ran away were eventually caught by slave catchers or betrayed by their own people. But their attempts inspired others and rattled the slaveholders. The existence of the Underground Railroad, while more effective in the Upper South, still reached into the Deep South in some cases, aided by networks of black and white anti-slavery agents. Go and learn about John Brown. I did a video about him too. Every successful escape, such as that of Solomon Northup, who regained freedom after 12 years, but this was kind of a different circumstance, was a victory against the slave system and a beacon of hope to those who were left behind. During the Civil War, mass escapes occurred as Union armies approached. Enslaved people in Alabama, Mississippi, and elsewhere flocked to Union lines whenever possible, seizing the opportunity to free themselves. Striking while the iron was hot, I suppose. They became contrabands in Union camps, or took up arms as soldiers in the United States colored troops. Now that's a video on its own. Their actions affirmed that enslaved people were not passive recipients of freedom, but active agents securing it. In the words of an enslaved minister, when freedom finally came, it was because we prayed for it. We kept praying and waiting on the Lord. But they also took action when the moment arrived. Survival and resistance, they go hand in hand. From quiet subversions of the plantation to the bold strike for liberty, when history presented them with the chance, finally. And so that was it. The daily life of a slave on a cotton plantation on the Deep South. Exploitation, endurance, resistance, survival. From the first pre-dawn blast of the horn to the exhausted last drudging step back into the cabin at night. It was a ceaseless labor under hostile conditions, a daily routine unimaginably long and grueling, governed by the sun's rise and the overseer's lash. Food, rest, family. These needs were barely accommodated. Brutal conditions left them hungry, exhausted, physically broken, while arbitrary cruelty and the perpetual threat of violence and family separation enforced the planter's authority. Yet within this bleak picture, we also discern the resilience and agency of these people. The voices of former slaves reveal that they found ways to live on, not merely just exist. In the flicker of a cabin firelight after midnight, a mother might teach her child another quiet song. Sunday evenings, slaves gathered to pray, sing of deliverance. A loving couple would jump over the broom under the moon, pledging themselves that they would love each other, even without legal sanction. At times, when oppression was too great to bear, a brave soul slipped through the net into the darkness to follow the North Star toward that eternal dream of freedom. And such was the paradox of the enslaved life. Extreme impression went with extraordinary fortitude. The historical accounts and narratives allow us to piece together this structured, detailed mosaic of the daily life of a slave. Not a life that anybody would willingly choose. It was imposed by the cruelest injustice. But those who lived it infused it with whatever meaning they could, through family, faith, and resistance. So when we look at the daily routines, the work, the punishment, the family ties, and coping mechanisms, we not only gain a sharper picture of the past, but a deep respect for the human spirit that endured, eventually overcoming this dark chapter in our history. The day-to-day endurance, the quiet resistance of the slaves, helped lay that groundwork for the eventual collective emancipation that came with the Civil War, that crescendo. The hardships they covered were a testament to the strength of the human spirit under this oppression, and when freedom finally arrived, it vindicated the years of faith and struggle that had sustained them. A long nightmare of toil, transformed into a legacy of survival and resilience that I hope inspires you to today. Imagine the moment in the year 1865 when a formerly enslaved man like Jordan Anderson penned a letter to his old master, politely declining an offer to return. I get $25 a month, with victuals and clothing, and the children go to school and are learning well. Anderson wrote of his new life in Dayton, Ohio. With subtle humor, he even asked for 32 years of back pay, totaling a whopping $11,680 before he would even consider returning to plantation work. It's a pretty remarkable letter. It captures the profound transition underway in the Deep South after the Civil War. 4 million enslaved individuals stood at the threshold of freedom, but were uncertain about what lay beyond. And so today, we're going to find out what actually did lay beyond. We'll talk about the lives of the freed slaves in the Deep South during those uneasy years followed by the Civil War. We'll focus on the states at the heart of the former Confederacy, being Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and a few of their neighbors, to understand how emancipation unfolded on the ground. It's going to be pretty perilous. Families reunited after long separations, black schools and churches springing up, and freed men seizing their first opportunities to vote and even hold office. Yet all of these gains came alongside harsh realities. Lacking land or capital, many freedmen fell into sharecropping and tenant farming, arrangements that echoed slavery in everything and all but name. After freedom, we worked on shares a while. We couldn't make nothing, just overalls and something to eat. Those were the words of Henry Blake of Arkansas, describing how half the crop went to the white landowner, and how debts kept black farmers bound to the soil. But politically, the promise of liberation was met with ferocious white resistance, black codes, vigilante violence, and the rise of the Klan, all aimed to keep freed people in a condition of helplessness. But through it all, the freedmen and freedwomen of the Deep South showed extraordinary resilience and initiative. They built new lives for themselves, with a determination that future generations would remember as quite heroic. So in this talk, we'll balance first-person accounts of former slaves with other contemporary sources to paint a vivid picture of Reconstruction-era life. We'll try and be as straightforward and scholarly as we can, but the human stories of hope and hardship, the courage on all the setbacks, I'm sure a bit of emotion will shine through. By the end, I hope you'll understand how emancipation in the Deep South was not just a single event, but rather an unfolding struggle, as those free people sought to turn newfound liberty into lasting prosperity, and eventually, equality. But allow me to first welcome you to the channel. Well, it's good to meet you all if you're newcomers. For those returning, good to see you again. Thank you to those who supported on the Patreon and those who checked out the merch store. And I invite you to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Just leave a comment. Okay, well, with all that out of the way, let's get on to the video, nice and relaxed. And so the story starts in 1865, when Union victory brought emancipation. The news spread like wildfire across plantations in the Deep South. For the men and women emerging from bondage, the end of slavery was met with a mixture of jubilation and anxiety. Many left the plantations immediately, some in joyous processions down dusty roads, others in quiet determination to find family members sold away years before. In these early months of freedom, the formerly enslaved tested the boundaries of their liberty. They adopted new surnames, often choosing Freeman, or the names of their heroes like Lincoln, signaling a break from their enslavers' identities. They set their own work schedules, no longer driven by the overseer's lash. But perhaps most importantly, thousands took to the roads in search of those long-lost loved ones. Family reunification was an urgent priority. A freedman named Hawkins Wilson, separated from his sisters decades earlier, wrote poignantly to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867. "I am anxious to learn about my sisters, from whom I have been separated many years. I've never heard from them since I left Virginia 24 years ago. I am in hopes that they are still living." Letters like Wilson's, along with hundreds of information wanted ads placed in newspapers, reveal the deep yearning of freed people to rebuild family ties broken by the oppressive system of slavery. In this chaotic window of freedom's dawn, the federal government stepped in to offer guidance and support. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, simply known as the Freedmen's Bureau, began its operations in the spring of 1865, certainly not wasting any time in the wake of the Union victory. Tasked with assisting in the transition from slavery to freedom, the Bureau tried to address the basic and urgent needs of the freed people. It provided emergency food, shelter, and medical care to destitute freedmen and refugees. Bureau agents helped African Americans locate relatives and legalize marriages that had been informally celebrated under slavery. Indeed, before the war, enslaved people could not marry legally. Did you know that? So, the Bureau performed numerous marriage ceremonies for couples who desired that formal recognition on paper. The Bureau also established rudimentary courts to give the freed people a measure of legal protection, at least in theory. Agents served as advocates for black citizens in local disputes, and they oversaw labor contracts between freedmen and planters to try to ensure some modicum of fairness. But all these efforts, however, unfolded amid tremendous uncertainty, and with that uncertainty came resistance. For the freed men and women themselves, the first decisions of freedom were often the hardest. Should they stay, or should they go? In Mississippi and Alabama, many freed people initially fled plantations to nearby towns or Union camps, eager to assert their independence. One Union officer in Georgia observed that upon emancipation, freed slaves exhibited a childlike excitement. They attended mass meetings, parades, and church services celebrating their newfound deliverance. One can hardly blame them for being overjoyed at the news. Yet, practical concerns soon tempered the celebrations. In the old system, they had accommodation. They had food. They had water. Now they didn't have it. So how would they eat? Where would they work? And where would they live? Of course, no one taught them how to seek out these things, so people just didn't know what to do. Few freed families owned any property, of course. and most had little more than the clothes on their backs, and that includes no tools to show up and sell your labor. Some planters, desperate to retain their labor force, persuaded freed people to remain on their land with promises of wages or shares of the crop. Others attempted brute intimidation. Across the Deep South in 1865, there were reports of planters refusing to announce emancipation at all, or chasing black families off their land at gunpoint if they tried to leave. In this uncertain environment, the Freedmen's Bureau functioned as an intermediary. Bureau officials traveled to plantations to announce that slavery was over in no uncertain terms, and to encourage planters to hire their former slaves for wages. They posted notices that freedmen should be treated and paid as free laborers, though such directives often went unenforced, especially in the early days. The Bureau urged freed people to return to work for the time being, reasoning that idleness could invite white retaliation or even starvation. This advice was not always welcome to the freed people, who felt they had already labored for their whole lives and got nothing. As one group of black Louisianans protested in 1865, quote, "We had labored long enough for nothing, and had now deserved something for ourselves." Yeah, fair enough. Their plea underscored a certain truth. Emancipation was not just about personal freedom, but it was also about economic independence, and that was going to be a whole new fight. But despite many obstacles, freedmen and women worked tirelessly to rebuild their personal lives on the foundation of their newfound freedom. Family stood at the center of this effort. Under slavery, spouses, children, and siblings had been routinely torn apart by either forced migration or sale. Now, recently freed people embarked on the difficult journeys, hoping to reconnect with their relatives. They scoured the countryside and neighboring states, following any lead they could get. It was common to see black men and women walking miles along southern roads, inquiring at every farm or contraband camp for a familiar name. Churches and Freedmen's Bureau offices became information hubs where people posted inquiries. Newspapers such as the Southwestern Christian Advocate in New Orleans ran the Lost Friends column, filled with heart-rending ads. A typical notice from 1867 might read, "Information wanted of my son, James, about 16 years old, last seen on the auction block of New Orleans in 1859. Any news of him will be thankfully received by his mother, Sarah." Scores of such advertisements circulated, testifying to both the trauma of familial separation and the hope that freedom brought a chance to heal those deep wounds. The Freedmen's Bureau assisted in opening mail registers to forward letters between separated kin, and by offering free transportation in some cases to reunite families. And slowly, many husbands found many wives, many sons found many mothers, many daughters, many fathers. Parents discovered the fates of those they thought were lost to them. Each reunion, a wife stepping off a bureau train to meet a husband she hadn't seen in a decade, or a father embracing a daughter, ripped away from him, sold as a child, marked a personal triumph of freedom. And marriage became another cornerstone of the new black society. Legal marriage had been denied under slavery. Enslavers recognized unions, but only informally. So formal weddings surged after the war. Freed couples flocked to bureau offices and local courthouses to get marriage licenses. In Mississippi, one bureau agent reported that freedmen were perfectly frantic to have their marriages legally sanctioned, believing it vital for the dignity and security of their families. By one estimate, the Bureau performed or recorded tens of thousands of marriages across the South during Reconstruction. These ceremonies carried enormous significance. They allowed husbands to claim rights over their wives and children, and that protected them from being taken away. But they also provided wives the lawful status that they had been denied. Freed people often chose new surnames as they married, a public assertion of family identity that owners had long refused to recognize. In one moving example, a North Carolina couple who had been separated and forced to marry others during slavery reunited in freedom and legally remarried, a testament to black families' perseverance through unspeakable hardships. So now, with families taking shape, freed people also built communities that became havens of support and cultural life. Churches were among the first institutions established. During slavery, black Christians in the Deep South had mostly been forced to worship under white supervision, often in the gallery pews of white churches, or in secret bush meetings. Emancipation brought a flowering of independent black churches, especially the Baptist and Methodist congregations. Across Georgia and South Carolina, for instance, freedmen left white churches en masse and founded their own, sometimes meeting in barns or former slave pens, until they could construct their own simple wooden chapels. And the church, of course, became the center of black communities, a place not only of worship but of education, political gathering, and mutual aid. Black ministers, who had been community leaders even under slavery, assumed their greater prominence in freedom. They preached messages of liberation and self-determination, and many also took up roles in politics and education. The spirituals sung in slave quarters now resounded in open-air camp meetings attended by the thousands. In these early years, religion and community were deeply intertwined. They gave the freed people moral strength and also practical organization. One cannot overstate the hunger formerly enslaved people had for education. To learn to read and write, long seen as privileges of the free, was an urgent aspiration for the freedmen's generation. Adults who had labored in the fields by day now begged for night classes. Children who had been forced to carry cotton sacks now clutched spelling books. As one former slave later remembered, it was a whole race trying to get to school for the first time. The Freedmen's Bureau, Northern Missionary Societies, and black communities themselves collaborated to set up schools across the South. By the end of 1865, more than 90,000 former slaves were enrolled as students in freedmen's schools, with attendance rates around 80%, and that's a pretty shocking achievement in such a short time, one must admit. An 1866 illustration depicts a classroom for freedmen in Vicksburg, Mississippi. In the scene, dozens of African-American students of all ages crowd the benches, eagerly holding their primers, while a white teacher stands in front of the class. Freedmen's schools like this sprang up throughout the Deep South, often started by black communities themselves with aid from the Freedmen's Bureau. Reading and writing were more than practical skills. They were symbols of liberation. At first, most of the teachers were volunteers from the North, missionaries, Quakers, and former Union soldiers' wives. But black teachers soon joined the ranks, many of them products of the very schools established between 1865 and 66. In churches and makeshift schoolhouses, these pioneers taught the ABCs and basic arithmetic. Their lessons also imparted the values of discipline and self-reliance that the freed people believed would finally elevate their race. Freedmen's Bureau reports from Alabama and Mississippi in 1867 marvel at how children and grandparents sat together in class, how students walked miles each day to attend. And the progress was rapid. Within a few years, literacy rates among southern blacks began to climb for the first time. Of course, there was white opposition to black education, and it was quite fierce. Arsonists and mobs targeted black schools, and some teachers were beaten or killed by vigilantes who saw black literacy as a threat. Even so, by 1870, the foundations of the public school system, open to African Americans, had been laid in many Deep South states, largely due to black-led Reconstruction movements. The ardent pursuit of education was one of the clearest successes of the post-Civil War years, and it gave rise to a new generation of African American leaders. But of all the challenges facing freed people, economic survival was perhaps the most formidable and immediate. Upon getting their freedom, many families had nothing but their own labor to sustain them. They hungered for land of their own, a dream encapsulated in the famous but ultimately unfulfilled phrase, 40 acres and a mule. In early 1865, Union General William T. Sherman had issued the Special Field Order No. 15, temporarily allocating abandoned coastal land in Georgia and South Carolina to freedmen in 40-acre plots. Roughly 40,000 freed people settled on this land that year, building high hopes that they would become independent farmers. And indeed, a committee of black ministers in Savannah told Sherman that for their people, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land. However, these hopes met a harsh reversal. President Andrew Johnson, upon taking office, ordered nearly all confiscated or abandoned lands returned to their pre-war owners in late 1865. The freedmen who had briefly tasted land ownership were promptly evicted from plantations that Union forces had handed them just months before. One can understand how frustrating this would have been. On Edisto Island in South Carolina, a group of freedmen who had cultivated land under Sherman's order wrote a moving petition when they were told to return the property to their former enslavers. "We were promised homesteads," they protested in October 1865, "and now the good and just government will not take us from all this right." One freedman, articulating the feelings of many, said to his former master, "The man who tied me to the tree and gave me 39 lashes, and who will not let me stay in his empty hut, except I will do his planting and be satisfied with his price, that man I cannot well forgive." The Edisto petitioners begged for the chance to purchase and keep their land that their sweat had cultivated, imploring, "Landless, homeless, voteless, we can only pray to God and hope for his help." But despite their pleas, the federal government's policy favored restoring land to ex-Confederates to speed up sectional reconciliation. And as a result, by 1866, most freed people in the Deep South remained without land, once again forced to work for others if they were to survive. With plantation owners retaining their property, a new labor system had to emerge. Neither planters nor freedmen could turn back the clock on slavery. Everybody knew that. But both sought to shape post-war labor to their advantage. In the immediate aftermath of the emancipation, that first year, from 1865 to 66, many areas saw attempts to institute yearly labor contracts. Planters, often through black codes passed by state legislatures, tried to mandate that freed people sign contracts by which they agreed to work for a white employer, and that was usually their former master, a year-long contract at paltry wages. I'm sure it all seemed very familiar to them. Well, for example, Mississippi's notorious Black Code of 1865 required that, quote, all freedmen with no lawful employment or business are deemed vagrants, essentially making it a crime to be unemployed. Believe it or not. Now, those who did not sign labor contracts could be arrested and forced into unpaid labor on public works, or even rented out to planters. Now, forced into unpaid labor. There's another word for that, and it starts with S. Good Lord. Well, the black codes across the Deep South also often prohibited black people from owning firearms, limiting their ability to rent land in cities, and set up harsh penalties for any insubordination. These laws were a clear attempt to reinstate white control over black labor and mobility. It's obvious by anyone's definition. And, surprise, surprise, freedmen fiercely resisted such measures. They refused to sign contracts that resembled slavery by another name, especially those that stipulated gang labor, whipping as discipline. Believe it or not, they still had that in the contracts, and restrictions on movements. Under pressure from the radical Republicans in Congress, outraged by the Black Codes, the Federal Military and Freedmen's Bureau intervened in 1866 to avoid the most oppressive contracts. Congress's Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment were, in part, reactions to these Black Codes, aiming to establish that black Americans had equal protection under the law. But still, the question remained. The question on everyone's mind was on what terms would freed people work the land that had once been worked by them as slaves. So, over the later 1860s, a compromise labor system known as sharecropping took root across much of the Deep South. It evolved as a sort of middle ground, albeit a pretty inequitable one, between planters' desire for a submissive labor force and the freedman's quest for autonomy. Instead of working under an overseer for a daily wage, which freed people distrusted, often with a damn good reason, the family would lease a plot of land from a large planter. This family would farm that parcel independently and then pay the landowner a share of the crop at the harvest time, typically a third or maybe a half. In theory, this arrangement appealed to both sides. Planters got their land cultivated without paying cash up front, and freedmen got a degree of independence in their daily work. By 1870, sharecropping had become the dominant labor arrangement for cotton and rice production in many Deep South states. However, the reality of it was, surprise, surprise, often harsh. Lacking seed, tools, or mule teams, freedmen usually had to borrow these necessities from the landowner, and guess what? It was all at steep interest. Either that, or you had to agree to plant a larger share of the cash crops like cotton instead of food. This led to many debt cycles that trapped farmers. Henry Blake's recollection of sharecropping vividly captures its pitfalls. He said, "When we worked on the shares, we couldn't make nothing. Just overalls and something to eat. Half went to the other man. A man that didn't know how to count would always lose. They never give you any details. They just say you owe so much." According to Blake, planters kept the books in such a way that by the end of the year many black families were told they owed more than they had actually earned. And guess what? That bound them to land for another year. Even those who could read and keep an account might be cheated, as the landowner controlled the weighing of cotton and the pricing. Sharecroppers were often kept in constant debt, a situation plantation owners secured by advancing supplies on credit and then deducting those costs with interest from the sharecropper's portion. As Blake put it plainly, you had to take the white man's word. Anything you wanted, you could get it if you were a good hand, but you better not try to leave and get caught. They'd keep you in debt. They were sharp. The sharecropping system also perpetuated a social dynamic reminiscent of slavery. While day-to-day farming life was under the freed people's control, the landowner's authority loomed large. Many contracts forbade sharecroppers from selling crops to anyone except the landowner, or leaving the plantation without permission. If a black tenant accumulated debt, local laws, and sometimes contract terms, gave the landowner a lien on the next year's crop, binding the sharecropper to the farm until the debt was paid. So in practice, it pretty much meant that a poor harvest or dishonest accounting could condemn a family to permanent peonage. It doesn't sound very fair, doesn't it? If a sharecropper somehow managed to produce a surplus, the credit system and low cotton prices usually left very little profit. Over time, an entire regional economy could sink into poverty. By the 1870s and 80s, vast numbers of black and many white farmers in the South were sharecropping on land that they did not even own, living on credit between harvests. It was a bitter irony that freedom's first generations often found themselves still economically subservient on the same soil where they had toiled as slaves in living memory. One observer in 1868 noted that the black farm laborer has a homestead in name, but not in fact, for it is really a part of his employer's plantation. Freed people, of course, they knew the system was unjust. It was hard not to notice, and some did manage to negotiate for slightly better terms. For instance, a smaller share to the owner, if they provided their own mule, or to become tenant farmers paying cash rent. That's a step above sharecropping. A small minority even saved enough to buy their own land. In most of the Deep South, however, black land ownership remained elusive for years to come. By 1880, a significant majority of black farmers in states like Mississippi and South Carolina were still tenant farmers or sharecroppers rather than independent landowners. And so economic struggle was not the only challenge in the fields. Planters and white vigilantes used violence and intimidation to enforce labor discipline. Throughout the late 1860s, reports abounded of planters' gangs, sometimes the very precursors of the Ku Klux Klan, riding around at night to scare black laborers into staying put. Henry Blake recalled that just after the war, we had to get in before night, too. If you didn't, the Ku Klux would drive you in. They would whip you if they could catch you out in the night time. Dubbed patrollers from the old slave patrols, these groups sought to terrorize freed people into compliance. Blake noted that such harassment continued for about 10 years after the war, until enough of the vigilantes were killed up by federal troops or armed black self-defense that the nightly raids subsisted. In some cases, confrontations over labor turned deadly. Black workers who tried to leave a plantation to seek better terms elsewhere might be assaulted or even lynched. Law enforcement, often in the hands of ex-Confederates, rarely intervened on behalf of black victims. And despite these dangers, countless freedmen bravely asserted their right to mobility and better employment. They voted with their feet, by moving when cheated or abused, contributing to a gradual diversification of black labor. Some found work in railroad construction, lumber camps, some women as washerwomen or barbers in towns. But for the vast majority in the Deep South, agriculture was really the only option for them, and sharecropping was the framework from within they pursued the fruits of freedom. But emancipation not only liberated the body, it eventually empowered the political voice of freedmen. After the Civil War, one of the most revolutionary changes in the Deep South was the entry of African American men into public life. In the immediate aftermath of the war, this political participation was minimal. Black people organized mass meetings and conventions to demand rights, but former slaves could not yet vote and held no office in the southern states. They began to change all of that with Congressional Reconstruction. By 1867, Congress had taken control of Reconstruction from President Johnson, and the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 to 68 granted the vote to black men in the former Confederacy, while of course temporarily disenfranchising many ex-Confederate leaders. In the Deep South, with its large black population, there was an unprecedented experiment taking place in biracial democracy. Turnout among freedmen was astonishingly high whenever they had the opportunity to vote. As early as 1867, equal rights leagues and political clubs organized by black communities were busy holding meetings across the South, instructing freedmen on the mechanics of voting and the importance of solidarity. Freed people viewed the vote as a safeguard for their freedom, a means to enact laws and policies that would protect their rights against any resurgence of slavery-like conditions. The urgency and excitement were of course palpable. Contemporary accounts describe how black men, many of them former slaves, lined up at voter registration offices in 1867 with a mixture of pride and determination. As Reconstruction governments were formed in the Deep South states, African Americans began to hold public office in significant numbers. During the late 1860s and early 1870s, some 2,000 freedmen held positions of public authority in the South, ranging from local officers like Justice of the Peace or Sheriff to seats in the state legislatures and even the U.S. Congress. In Mississippi, which had a black population majority, voters elected several black statewide officials and sent the first African-American senator in U.S. history, Hiram Revels, to Washington in 1870. Georgia's legislature in 1868 included dozens of black representatives, though white Democrats later expelled them until federal intervention reinstated them. South Carolina's legislature became the first in American history with a black majority, led by Speaker of the House, Robert Smalls, himself a formerly enslaved man, who famously seized a Confederate ship during the war. Not bad. Well, these were extraordinary developments. Mere years earlier, these individuals had been considered property, and now they were making the laws. Their presence was a testament to both the possibilities opened up by emancipation and the leadership that emerged from within the black community itself. Freedmen in office typically focused on securing the rights and well-beings of their constituents. They advocated for public education, economic opportunity, and equal justice under the law. Just for an example, black legislators were instrumental in creating the first statewide public school systems in the Deep South. They pushed for laws to prohibit racial discrimination in transportation and public accommodations, with some success, as in Louisiana for a time. Of course, that fight would continue well into the 20th century. Importantly, black political leaders often worked in alliance with white Republicans, derisively labeled carpetbaggers and scallywags by opponents. Scallywag, haven't heard that word in a while. Of course, this is all to advance a Reconstruction agenda. But their gains prompted bitter opposition. Most white Southerners, especially former Confederates and conservative planters, could not countenance black political power. They They saw the political elevation of former slaves as an inversion of the social order and reacted with outrage and aggression. The backlash was swift and violent. Supremacist organizations, the most infamous being the Klan, emerged to restore the white democratic control through terrorism. Founded in Tennessee in 1866, the Klan spread into Deep South states. By 1868 and 1869, operating as a clandestine armed wing of those who opposed Reconstruction. They targeted black voters, elected officials, and white allies, such as the teachers or local Republican leaders. Nighttime raids by the Klan and similar groups like the White League in Louisiana or the Red Shirts in Mississippi involved whippings, shootings, and even just random lynchings. The aim was to frighten the freedmen away from the polls and to assassinate and intimidate any who represented them. A Bureau report from Kentucky in 1867 detailed how a black man was assaulted, threatened, and driven from his home for giving information to the agents of the Bureau. Another was severely whipped for not cooperating with the white mob. And these incidents were not isolated either. During the 1868 presidential election campaign, violence against black communities reached a crescendo. Dozens were killed in political massacres in Louisiana's Opelousas and St. Landry parishes. And in Camilla, Georgia, a political rally was attacked by armed whites. But despite all this, many freedmen bravely continued to participate in politics, some even arming themselves in self-defense or drilling in informal militias for their own protection. For several years, the federal government responded with measures to suppress the Klan and protect black voters. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 to 71, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, gave President Ulysses S. Grant authority to use federal troops and suspend habeas corpus, in order to crush the Klan insurgency. In parts of South Carolina, for example, hundreds of Klansmen were arrested, and Klan activity temporarily waned. These efforts allowed the freedmen's political participation to continue in the short term. In 1872, Louisiana even saw P.P.S. Pinchback, a man of mixed race, serve briefly as the acting governor, a scenario completely unimaginable just years before. However, as the 1870s progressed, Northern commitment to military enforcement of black rights began to erode. Economic concerns, like the Panic of 1873, and political fatigue in the North led to somewhat of a pullback. One by one, Reconstruction governments in the Deep South were overthrown by white democratic redeemers, often through campaigns of fraud and violence. Mississippi's 1875 elections were notoriously violent, effectively marking the end of Reconstruction, there as white Democrats reclaimed their power and openly celebrated driving out the blacks from politics. By 1877, with the withdrawal of the last federal troops as part of a national political compromise, Reconstruction had effectively ended. And in its wake, most black Southerners were left politically disenfranchised, despite the formal protections of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Even so, the achievements during those brief years were real and lasting in some respects. Black political activism did yield tangible changes, new state constitutions in the South that expanded rights and social services, and the principle, if not consistent practice, of equal citizenship for African Americans. Moreover, the fact that freedmen had exercised the vote and held office set a precedent that would inform future generations. Well, we certainly see a poignant mix of triumph and tragedy, I think. Triumph in their ability to organize, advocate, and even govern, but that tragedy in the violent overthrow of their efforts. And of course, the end of Reconstruction, only means the onset of the Jim Crow segregation that followed, a topic for another time. But still, the freedmen of the Deep South had shown what they were capable of when given their franchise, an active engagement with democracy that belied every myth of their incapacity. This was a legacy that would lie dormant, but not dead. It awaited the civil rights movements of many decades later to finally be revived. And so, in the years immediately following the Civil War, the freed slaves of the Deep South embarked on an arduous journey. The story is one of resilience in the face of a monumental challenge. We've seen how freedmen and freedwomen labored to reconstitute their families, scouring the land for those lost relatives, and finally getting that marriage officially sanctioned. We have witnessed their zeal for education, cramming schools to learn the literacy they had been forbidden, and laying the groundwork for public schooling in the South. We've also seen their fight for economic independence, as they negotiated new labor systems and asserted their rights against exploitative sharecropping contracts, even as many remained locked into poverty on the very plantations they had been enslaved. We followed their entry into politics, where they claimed a voice in their own communities, voted by the thousands, held public office, and transformed Southern governments, at least for a few brief years. And we also saw the fierce backlash, the black codes that sought to chain their newfound freedom, the night riders who tried to cow them into submission, and the eventual collapse of Reconstruction under the pressures of white supremacist violence and waning Northern support. The era immediately after the Civil War was certainly a formative period for the Deep South. The formerly enslaved people didn't passively experience these changes, they were active agents of them. They had to shape their own destiny, and no one was going to do it for them. Their testimonies and actions contradict any notion that freedom was simply given to them, that's for sure. Instead, they had to take it, and they had to try and breathe full life into it, often at great personal risk. An elderly freed woman in Alabama perhaps summed it up the best way when she said later, "We had a hard road, but thank the Lord that we were on our way." For all the setbacks and sorrows, and there are plenty of them, from the heartbreak to the unfulfilled promises to the sting of segregation imposed later, the achievements of the freedmen's generations were certainly significant. And so in closing, consider again the voice of Jordan Anderson, the freedman whose letter we encountered at the introduction of this video. Anderson never did return to the old Tennessee plantation. Instead, him and his wife raised their children in Ohio, and he reportedly lived out his days in dignity, the master of his own home. His story was just one among the thousands of free slaves who sought better lives far from those cotton fields. Most freed people, of course, remained in the South, where they would endure another century of struggle for equality. But the era of Reconstruction was certainly not in vain. It was, in fact, the first real civil rights movement in American history, a time when those who had been in shackles stood up and claimed membership in a nation's civic life. The freedmen and freedwomen of the Deep South left an imprint on their region. Through hardship and against ferocious opposition, they forged communities, asserted their humanity, and kept alive that promise of democracy. So as we conclude, the words of a black minister addressing a Reconstruction-era church comes to mind. We are rising. Despite all that happened in the years immediately after the Civil War, the good, the bad, or the violent, the freed slaves of the Deep South were indeed rising, and their ascent would reverberate long into the future, where a new fight awaits. Well, of course, that's something we'll talk about in a Jim Crow video and all the rest. I'll get there eventually. If you really want me to make it, I suppose you can leave me a comment and tell me that you want me to make it. I don't know. Do whatever you like. You're probably asleep by now anyway. Anyway, I'm going to thank my top tier patrons. That is Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Talvery. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And I will see you in the next video. Good night for now, everyone. And as always, lots of love to you all.